Good evening. Welcome to the February 18th meeting of the Town Council Joint Parking Authority. Clerk, at this time I'd like everybody to silence their communication devices if you haven't done so already. And I'd like to call on the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Diane McNutt.
Here.
Councilmember Barbara Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Joe Przynski.
Here.
Vice Mayor Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Steve Leonardis.
Here. At this time I would like to invite Karen Trolin up to say the Pledge of Allegiance, lead us in the pledge this evening. And I'm going to say a few things about Karen. Karen moved to Los Gatos in 1972. She's been married for 31 years to Steve. She has two sons, TJ and Andrew, and a daughter, Lindsay. She's a Silvar board member and was the board of director and the past district chair for Silvar, which is the Silicon Valley Association of Realtors. She is a member of the Tech Rescue. She's a Tech Rescue team leader for the Los Gatos Montessorino Police Department on DART. She is a CYSA competitive soccer head coach and also CYSA referee. She is a North Star Ski Patrol instructor. She loves to travel. She participates in many sports, including Eskrima, which is martial arts in the Philippines, snow and water skiing, swimming, bicycling, horseback riding, rappelling, and ATVing. Karen is a triathlete. She is ranked in martial arts with a second degree in Taekwondo, a black belt in Kenpo Jitsu, a 6th level in Shin Kendo and To Yamaru, and a 1st level brown belt in Jiu-Jitsu. And many of these martial arts deal with knives. Is that what? So watch out for Karen. Knives and swords. What she loves most about Los Gatos is that it is a mountainous location with a friendly small town feel. So Karen, would you give us the honor of leading us in the pledge?
Thank you for standing. I pledge allegiance to the flag in the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
How about a round of applause for Karen Trolin? Thank you. Another round of applause for Karen. Our new segment this year is Small Business, Big Applause. And tonight we have the honor of honoring one of our businesses called Icing on the Cake in Los Gatos, which has been in town since 1985. And for myself, walking into Icing on the Cake has always been a most pleasant experience. First of all, there's the cleanliness, the aroma, the service has always been quite friendly, and you cannot get out of that place without buying something. It is the epitome of what Los Gatos is in the business community. Their generosity in the community year after year, supporting our events locally in town, including our police foundation, is very much appreciated. But most of all, honoring Icing on the Cake and saying thank you. We know there are other communities who would probably love to steal you from us, but year after year you choose to remain in Los Gatos and keep it as your home for your business, and we are so glad that we have you. I would like to ask Lynn Magnoli to come forward. I'm going to present you with accommodation. Well, our staff will enjoy those, I'm sure. Whereas Icing on the Cake is a retail bakery in downtown Los Gatos owned and operated by Lynn Magnoli since its opening in September 1985. Whereas Icing on the Cake offers classic American baked goods with a nostalgic feel, as well as a variety of unique products, including greeting cards, housewares, gifts, and holiday merchandise. And whereas Icing on the Cake gives back to the community through monthly donations to a wide variety of fundraising efforts, and outside of Los Gatos, and larger annual events such as the Taste of Los Gatos and Rivers of Chocolate events. And whereas Lynn Magnoli is a proud Los Gatos business owner who appreciates the customers she and her wonderful staff serve, and the high-quality products and services offered by the bakery. And whereas a trip to Icing on the Cake is always a treat, now therefore the town council of the town of Los Gatos does hereby render with special appreciation and commendation to Icing on the Cake for 29 years of dedicated service to the town of Los Gatos and its residents, dated February 18th, 2014. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Icing on the Cake. You're welcome. I often go in and I buy an Lolliberry pie about 5 p.m. and by the next morning it's gone. Just to let you know, I recommend that. Would you like to share a few words? You don't have to. I know we're putting you on the spot.
I'm thankful to have been in this town for so long. I go back a long time. I'm very emotional tonight. I'm sorry. But I've seen the town change and grow, and I'm just glad that I'm here watching that happen. It's really nice and important to me and my staff. So thank you. I appreciate this very much.
You're very welcome. This is the very reason why we invented this segment, to give these business owners an opportunity to come in and show them that we appreciate them and them continuing to be successful in our community.
It is. It's a great community. We feel very loved here.
You are very loved. All right. Well, thank you, Lynn. And this is for you to take home, and you can, or hang it up at your business.
We have walls now. More walls.
More wall space.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Next on our agenda is our closed session report. I'd like to call the town attorney.
Yes, good evening. Prior to tonight's regular session, council met in closed session to discuss pending litigation. The pending litigation discussed was the Albright Way Development Project. As to this item, council took no action that requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Next, I would like to welcome any members of the public who would like to speak this evening on any topic not on the agenda to fill out a speaker card found in the seats in front of you and hand it to the clerk. Moving on to council and manager matters. Does any member of council have something they would wish to share with council? Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to report on our recent activities on behalf of the town, I attended the Metropolitan Transportation Commission meeting on February 12th as a member of the commission, and on February 13th, the Cities Association, we had a presentation from the Housing Trust and a request that monies that would be coming back to us with the dissolution of RDA be earmarked for housing, for affordable housing, and we will take that up with our councils as appropriate. And it was agreed by the commission, or rather by the association, that that this would be an issue that we need to seriously address.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. On February 13th, I went to the VTA Policy Advisory Committee, and the most interesting thing arising from that, well, there was actually two things. First was a VTA proposal to comment on EIR reports with respect to impacts on freeway traffic created by developments, and an idea for jurisdictions to ask for that comment, then ask for VTA to participate in perhaps coming up with a dollar amount for a developer or a proponent of a project to pay for impacts on the freeway. The other interesting thing for those of you, and I'm looking at Councilwoman Spector, who attend 49ers games, there was talk about doing transit for the new Levi Stadium, which was interesting, and how they were going to coordinate that, hopefully successfully.
Further reports. I have a couple reports. Since our last meeting, I attended a meeting of the West Valley Sanitation District Board of Directors and the West Valley Solid Waste Advisory Committee. And both of those were general business meetings. And in addition to those meetings, I attended the Silicon Valley State of the Valley Conference with 5 members of our Planning Commission. That's all I have to report. Moving on to our consent items. Oh, manager matters, I'm sorry.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, only one item to report from staff. We are again seeking applicants for town boards and commissions to be interviewed by the council on Monday, March 17th. The 3 commissions we're currently looking for applicants for are the Arts and Culture Commission, the Transportation and Parking Commission, and the newly established Housing Element Advisory Board. All applications are due to the Office of the Clerk Administrator by Friday, March 7th at 12 noon. So again, 3 commissions, applications due Friday, March 7th at 12 noon. Thank you.
Thank you. Now moving on to our consent calendar. Does any member of council wish to pull an item for consent? Vice Mayor.
I'm not sure if I want to pull it. I do want to ask a question of staff with regard to item 6, vacating the easements on Albright.
Go ahead.
And the question is, perhaps to Mr. Schultz, what effect, if any, would a council action with respect to the easements have on the initiative? So this would be the town taking action on its approved ordinance, approving the Albright office development, when there's an initiative out there which would change it. So what effect would that action have?
So that's a very good question. I think what we do tonight is we would approve the intent to, and that's something I can come back with, and we might have to have language in there if, in fact, if the initiative passes, obviously, then the, well, either way, really, because their project is substantially the same. So if the initiative passes, they would still need this vacation of the right-of-way, and if it doesn't, it's still required under your PD. So I think either way, it would not affect the outcome of the initiative, but it's certainly something I can take a closer look at when it comes back to you in March.
Follow-up? The follow-up is the council action that's contemplated under our consent item, if I understand it, is simply to put it on another calendar indicating our intent to do that under our approved ordinance, correct?
And under the state law.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I will be abstaining from 1A, the minutes of February 3rd, since I was not here. And if I might ask one question of Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
I also had a question with regard to agenda item 6, and I'm thinking maybe I should pull it, but let me ask you first. Assuming that the initiative needs or would ask for the easements, can those easements be granted via an initiative as opposed to a vacation by the holder of the easements, the town?
I think if the specific plan that's trying to be adopted in the initiative specifically requires the easements to be vacated, we would still, just as we do right now, is follow that up with having to do that through the Streets and Highways Code. I don't think you can circumvent the Streets and Highways Code. You still have to have the hearing date set. So regardless if the initiative's passed, you still have to go through this process and do the intent to vacate
Through the council?
through the council.
I'm going to pull this from the consent calendar because I just need to burrow down on this a little bit.
Okay, so item 6 has been pulled. We'll hear it immediately after approval of the rest of the consent calendar. Vice Mayor?
Move approval of the consent calendar, which now consists of items 1 through 5.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Passes unanimously
With one abstention.
with one abstention. And moving on to item 6. So, Councilmember Spector, would you like to tell us why you wanted to pull this item?
The reason that I stated was following up from the Vice Mayor's questions, which raised an issue for me, is if the town has to go through a vacation process for the easements that it holds on the property, what is the effect of the initiative on that issue, since the initiative isn't going through the council? So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the process is. I don't know how it works. So that's why I'm raising the issue.
Okay. Mr. Schultz.
So just as your current PD that was approved by council said that you shall abandon these easements, we're following through with your previous approval and going through that separate process through the Streets and Highway Code that requires for the official abandonment of those easements that were specified in your PD. If in fact that PD is overturned through the initiative process and the specific plan is adopted, the specific plan would then also require the same vacation of these same easements. So either way, you would still be required to abandon the easements. And so you'd already have done it through this process to begin with.
Councilmember Spector.
Mr. Schultz, do you have any understanding as you sit there tonight, as to what language the initiative has as it relates to the abandonment of the easements?
No, I don't.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor? We could, even at this late date, ask to have that question addressed in the 9212 study, which comes back on March 3rd, and see if it's possible to address that.
Thank you. Vice Mayor?
Following up on Councilwoman Spector's questions, is the initiative, make up a word here, self-effectuating, such that if it were to pass, and it contains language, which I believe it does based on reading it, that requires abandonment of the easements, is it really necessary for the town to do something now rather than wait to see if the town's ordinance is essentially upheld by a no vote on an initiative if it's put on a ballot? Or if the initiative makes its own law and abandons the easement, why does the town council need to take an action now?
You would still have to abandon those easements from a legal standpoint with a legal document that could be filed with the county clerk. You can't file those documents, the specific plan specifically, if it does have that language in it about abandoning the easements. Okay. So you still have to go through that process to abandon it under the Streets and Highways Code.
Well, so my question is, why now? If the council decides to put an initiative on the ballot, which contains a provision of abandoning the easements, and the town council has to take an action, why does the town council have to take an action now in advance of the election in June?
I don't know of any requirement that requires you to do it right now. Maybe other staff does. I'm not familiar enough with where we are in the project and why the easements need to be abandoned right now, whether there's work going on pursuant to your project or not.
Okay, Mr. Manager?
Yes. The applicant or the property owner is proceeding under the plan development that the council approved, and this is the next step in their process. In terms of the discretion the council has or authority the council has to delay action, that's certainly something we could research and provide in the report for your March 17th public hearing on this matter.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We may be dealing with semantics, but I would assume if the initiative were not in progress and we were dealing with this as a result of our having made the decision early on the Albright project, then we would be doing this at this point in time because it needs to happen at a certain point. If indeed the concern is that the initiative will change something at a certain date later in June, then if needs be, we can always come back and do the intent to vacate at that time. I don't see any reason for us not to go ahead and move this process forward, since this is a reflection of what we intended to do and what was in our specific decision regarding that property. So my recommendation would be to move forward with this, because we can, if needs be, if somehow this initiative makes this no longer valid, then we can come back and do it over again at that point in time.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. I realize that we have the potential here for public hearing, but I guess I did not anticipate that this would be pulled from the consent calendar, but as I'm listening to staff and council speak, my inclination is to delay this hearing, intent to vacate, until after the initiative. I haven't heard any reason to act in contrary to that, so that's where I am right now.
I'm going to call on myself. One of the questions I had was with the valuation of the easements, and I know that we have a document from an appraiser in our desk item, but it's an opinion of value letter. It's not necessarily an appraisal in the sense where it has no empirical data or comparisons of other instances when this has occurred. And what's interesting to me is the amount of easements in question. It's 2.8 acres of essentially what is public access. It's not land that we own, but it's the right for the public to cross that land. And when these easements become abandoned by the town and the project moves forward, it will be private access. So the public will no longer have that right. And what I'm interested in knowing is what is the value of the right of the public access, if any, in a more complete form, not just necessarily an opinion of value, but an actual valuation model or comparison. So I would like to see more data on this in terms of a real appraisal, and then make a decision. And maybe the council's decision will be to abandon it regardless of the value, or maybe the council will make another decision. But I still want to see that information presented. Vice Mayor.
If there's no one from the public that wishes to address us on this issue, I would be prepared to make a motion, but I see somebody coming forward.
We have, I'm sorry, Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things before we have public comment or get farther into this with motions. All we are being asked to do tonight is set the date for the public hearing. All of these issues can be more thoroughly discussed and vetted on March 17th. I don't understand why we would want to try to delay a project we've already approved. So to arbitrarily delay a project that's in the works for 3 or 4 months, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I just wanted to get that out there before we hear from them.
Thank you, Councilmember McNutt. My intention is to move it forward properly with the correct information so the council could make its decision. at this point in time, this decision could have very well been made a couple of years ago if the project were moving forward at that time. But I feel like at this point we have some time between now and at least the initiative to perhaps send staff back and get some more complete data and then make a more informed decision, which may prevent us from other issues later. So that's where I'm going with my request for more information. Further discussion? Seeing none, let's open up the public hearing on this. And I have a card from Reed Molds.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. My name is Reed Molds, 203 Redwood Shores Parkway, Redwood City. I'm representing the developer, Los Gatos, LG Business Park, LLC. What I really just wanted to state tonight is that the right-of-way abandonment that you have in front of you is consistent with and contemplated by the 2013 approvals, which the abandonment was required by the PD that was granted. We are proceeding with work pursuant to those approvals. Currently, today, we've been pulling permits to that. We have teams out there that have been prosecuting this work. And, of course, this vacation pertains to an easement that was granted several years ago by the original developer of the project. And today, this is something that we are looking to obviously reconfigure in my mind. And I have our attorneys here that can answer any questions of yours. But this is not, in my mind, a taking away of the 2.9 acres. There are going to be more acres under easements granted back to the town. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. Thank you for continuing to support the project. If you have any questions of me or my team, we're here.
Thank you, Mr. Molds. Are there any questions? Vice Mayor.
Mr. Molds, thank you. My concern is that clearly I support the town, what the town has done, and that you should proceed under that. However, we have an initiative before us that is not what the town has done. It's the same with respect to easements. However, it would, if passed, rescind the town action. So my concern is if the council were to go forward with an action under its approved project, and then that gets somehow rescinded, what rights are the town giving up, or what rights is the town giving to the developer by taking an action under our approved ordinance, which is now being challenged by way of initiative?
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none. Next speaker is Margot Bradish.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. My name is Margot Bradish. I'm a partner with Cox, Castle & Nicholson, and I represent the applicant, LG Business Park, LLC. I'd like to just briefly address a couple of the points that have been raised as questions. I know Mr. Schultz has already given his legal opinion, but I just wanted to chime in on a few items. First of all, under the street vacation procedure under state law, there isn't a requirement that there be a project approval ordinance initiative or otherwise that precedes the vacation. The question at issue under the state law is the street any longer required for public access? In this case, you have a property owner who, a prior owner, dedicated this easement to the town for the express purpose of providing access to this property, and you now have a property owner who says that access is no longer needed, whether it's no longer needed because of the project that you've already approved, whether it becomes no longer needed because of the initiative, or whether they just don't want it anymore. The point under the state law is that the right-of-way is no longer needed, and that's the basis under state law for the town to abandon the easement. So I don't think the pendency of the initiative really affects the action you're being asked to take under the state right-of-way vacation procedure. It's just a question of is it necessary anymore, and the answer to that is no. In addition to that, by virtue of abandoning the easement, the town will be relieved of significant expense in terms of the maintenance of the right-of-way and any liability associated with the ownership of the easement. So I think there's actually an economic benefit to the town. Under the state law, because the property owner retained the underlying fee ownership and only dedicated the easement for the use for access to the property, there's no property right that the town is giving up here that would be the subject of compensation. I know you have the opinion of value. It's not an appraisal, but I think sort of a legal question, that is that there's no compensation available under this set of facts. And then finally, with respect to the question of timing, as the manager mentioned, the applicant is moving forward with development, preliminary work, grading, et cetera, under the existing entitlements that were granted by this council. Work needs to commence in the area of these easements and can't until the town grants this abandonment. So if you were to delay this action tonight, it would delay construction, it would delay the ultimate construction of the buildings and the occupancy by the intended tenant. So it is really critical to the project that this action go forward as planned tonight. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Bradish? Vice Mayor?
Thank you. I just want to make sure I understand you that what you're telling us is that it's critical for the development or the developer to go forward under the town council approved ordinance, and yet it's pursuing an initiative which may change that ordinance.
The initiative does not change anything with respect to where the construction would take place and why the easement vacation is necessary. The initiative really is intended to implement the ordinance, and I know you have another agenda item on your agenda tonight, so I don't want to belabor the point now, but the initiative really just implements what you've already done. It's a time-saving mechanism. Nothing in the initiative changes the need for the right-of-way abandonment or where the buildings would go or anything. And as I said, it's sort of not legally relevant to the question of the vacation because they could come ask for a vacation without having any approvals at all if they decided they no longer needed this road for access to their site.
Director.
What provisions with regard to the easements did you put in your initiative?
The initiative language is, I think Mr. Spector would like to, Mr. Schultz would like to answer that. The language is identical to what's in your ordinance in the initiative. There's no change in the initiative with respect to the right-of-way abandonment.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Schultz, did you have a comment?
Yes, earlier council member Spector asked where that was in the specific plan, and I couldn't reference it off the top of my head, but I did find that under 5.2.2, the street vacation is listed, and that says all streets within the specific plan area shall be private. The Albright Way and Albright Court right-of-ways shall be vacated in accordance with applicable law. So regardless of whether the project is as approached in the PD, said the same thing. You shall abandon those right-of-ways according to applicable law. That's why it's in front of you now. The same would happen if the initiative, if you don't take the action tonight, you'd have to take it if the specific plan was approved.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. So when the initiative makes reference to applicable law, who determines? Is it the town? You determine what applicable law is?
My reference to that would be the Streets and Highways Code that specifically requires you to go through this process before you abandon the right-of-way.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
If the council were to take an action as requested to indicate an intent to abandon, are we now bound by that, or could we change our mind? Have we now said we are going to abandon by making a motion that says we intend to abandon?
No, it's only your intent tonight. You still have a public hearing, and we can address any of your questions in more detail regarding the exact procedure under the Streets and Highways Code to make sure you're comfortable, and also nail down even more language maybe in the resolution that specifically states what occurs if the initiative was to pass or fail, if that is an issue that is a concern after more legal research. But the intention is just that. The Streets and Highways Code requires you to do the first resolution of your intent, setting the public hearing. It requires then notice to be published in the paper, and so that's the requirement for tonight's hearing.
Thank you. One more speaker, John Shepherdson.
Yes, 120 Oak Rim. I didn't really plan on speaking about this, but I just wanted to mention a few things. One is I recall when this issue was being considered that we had the one of the staff persons calculating on a napkin, as I recall, the valuation or the amount of square footage acreage that was involved here. And so if we have an opportunity to look into this further in terms of getting a valuation of what we're actually giving away, I think that's a benefit to the town. I know personally, I called an appraiser and I asked him, how do you value something like this? And he said, well, if it's not really worth anything to the town, but it's worth a lot to the developer, what you often do is you split the difference. So if it's worth $1 million to the developer and it's worth nothing to the town, then you split the difference, and it may be worth $500,000. And so if it's something like that, and we have an opportunity to educate the public about exactly what we're vacating or abandoning, I think that there is benefit to the community if we do that. And secondly, I've also heard this is the developer is seeking to rescind the town's approval. They're actively doing that. They spent over $250,000 to do that. So they're engaged in that process. And if they're doing that, I think that that's action reflecting that's something that the council should consider in evaluating what it does tonight, because they're saying they're critical to move forward, but we don't like what the town approved. And what if an alternative ballot is passed or is suggested by the council so that their ballot doesn't pass? And what if the lawsuits find that the approval is not legal? Where are we there? So there's a number of things that I just offer for the council's consideration as it makes this decision. And I would suggest that they are very different. We're talking about bridges that weren't in the original approval. Why they put it in the ballot, why didn't they do this before? And so I think that's very different. Of course, the control that's exercised, the community development director is now going to determine what's substantial or not between the two. And I heard that there was a mention of a time-saving mechanism. That's why they're bringing the ballot measure. What is a time-saving mechanism? What does that mean? So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherdson. That was the last card I have on this item. Are there any more speakers? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and look to Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a question of staff. If we were to do what's being asked of us tonight, which is just to set the hearing date for March 17th, which is roughly a month from now, would staff have enough time to develop the answers and the background information that would address all of the concerns that you've heard during this discussion so far?
All of the concerns is quite a broad statement.
That are relevant?
I think we could certainly answer the questions of what is the obligation of the town to act on March 17th? Are there any development or property owner rights that require you to act, or do you have discretion to delay? And I think we could answer that. I think we could look and have our independent consultant kind of compare the approved plan development and the proposed ballot measure and for treatment of easements and vacation of easements. The more challenging one is to look at a new way of appraising, given what our appraiser said. We could, through property tax records, identify what the property owner paid for the property, divide that by the acreage, and apply it to the 2.9 acres and give you that number. We have tracked, at the mayor's request, one other jurisdiction, San Jose, that had another governmental entity that wanted its easements, and San Jose sought to obtain value for those and was unable to do so. Per the mayor's prior request to staff, we could see if there are any contrary examples. That's the only one we've seen so far where the governmental entity in our role was not able to obtain value, but we could seek exceptions to that.
So at least 80% of what you heard you could have together. We're not locked in. On March 17th, we could say, no, we're not going to do this, or we could postpone it indefinitely. And the attorney's shaking his head, yes.
I don't know if indefinitely, if at that hearing on March 17th, if you did not have some answers, staff came back with 95% of your answers, but there were still new questions that were developed, you could continue that hearing to a specific date.
And that date could be July 1st or
yes.
June. Not here in July, but June 9th or something like that. Okay. So the downside is if we don't set the date, we're jeopardizing the project moving ahead. And if we do set the date, we're not locked in. So I think we should go ahead. I'll go ahead and make a motion and see where we go with that. I'll just do it as accept council agenda report number 6 and setting March 17th as the public hearing date for the next discussion of this.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would ask the maker of the motion if she would include as part of her motion that when this matter comes back before us, that it include a response to the following. One is what effect, if any, would the approval of this abandonment have on the initiative, i.e., would it be in other words, would it expedite the initiative because it would give pre-approval to the abandonment that would normally come after the initiative is passed? And secondly, also include in the motion have staff consider the value of use. I do understand that we have been told that there's no value, but if the town has a use and it loses that use, reconsider evaluation of that loss. So the question is, would the maker of the motion consider that as part of her motion?
Yes.
The seconder?
Seconder.
Okay.
Thank you. I will support the motion then.
Further discussion, Vice Mayor?
I just have a question of staff, just to make sure. Mr. Schultz, there's no time limit or deadline under the States and Highways Code, correct?
Deadline as to when we're
As to when the town needs to take action. So this is coming to us essentially, I think, as a request of the developer? We aren't complying with a deadline under the code, correct?
We're not.
All right. So with that understanding, I will support the motion as well.
Further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Moving on to verbal communications. I have 2 cards. The first is Cheryl Jensen.
Mr. Mayor and Council, I would like to invite you as a council and all the citizens of Los Gatos to a meeting on the 25th of February in the Saratoga Public Library, at which time we will get an explanation of the Route 85 Express Lane project from the VTA person who's in charge, Mr. Rizzo. And then the public will have a chance to speak about this project because no public hearing has been set. So the citizens have decided to take it on themselves to provide a public hearing. I don't know how much this council knows about that project, but VTA plans to take our light rail space in the 85 corridor and change it into an express lane for paid travelers. In addition to that, they're planning to take the carpool lane and also make that for paid single drivers plus the carpools. This is adding 1 lane each way to what is actually a 6-lane road now, increasing the capacity of that freeway by 1/4. When this freeway was built, I measured the decibel level before anything happened. It was between 35 and 40 decibels in that corridor at the max. Now it is often above 70. This means that it's gone up 30 decibels for everybody living near that corridor, and for the rest of the city of Saratoga and for part of Campbell and Los Gatos, that noise goes off into the community, and it's created quite a noise. When you add a quarter to each side, this could, and trucks, because the environmental assessment now says we're going to have trucks. this could go up to 80 decibels, which is really an industrial thing now. It doesn't match our communities, and it doesn't make any sense either. When you drive on 85, you have choke points where 85 crosses 280 and joins 280 going north. I have driven that, and you have a 15-minute delay there just for that problem intersection. They're not planning to change that. They're just going to pile more traffic right into that area. Same thing with 280 going north on 85, joining 85. You have a choke point there that can often just bring the traffic to a standstill. Nothing will change there, and all they'll do is back it up to our communities here with people thinking they can get by but can't. So please come to that meeting. You're invited. I hope you'll come.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. We have a question from Councilmember Spector.
Actually, it probably is not for you, if I may ask a question of staff.
Yes.
Just for my edification, what is the process for this reconfiguration that she is describing? Who makes the decision and what happens along the way?
VTA, the Valley Transportation Agency, is the lead agency for the expansion of the lanes on Highway 85. That is currently in an EIR, environmental review process. The comment deadline has been extended, I believe, to February 24th, if I'm correct. And then the VTA will have the same public process that the council would have on approving a project.
So the VTA will make the ultimate decision?
VTA makes the ultimate decision.
Thank you, sir.
Can I just mention that it's the February 28th is a deadline for comments. There is no EIR. This is an environmental assessment. There is no EIR.
This comes under federal environmental law, I believe, which is,
well,
whether it's CEQA or, yeah.
There is no EIR. There is no mitigation. In fact, in the environmental assessment, the segment on this freeway from Winchester to Saratoga Avenue was left off. So there's no mitigation for anything.
Let me clarify. No comments are being asked for the environmental document. It's in a public review process now. Those comments are due by, I guess, the 28th.
So it's still in process?
It's still in process.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Jensen.
And the town has not taken a position or considered the project to date.
Okay. Thank you. Next speaker is John Shepherdson.
I just want to share some information about white roofs. This is really a concept from Arthur Rosenfeld, sort of the guru for energy in California and the country and the world. And so I'm just going to sort of show some of these slides from his PowerPoint. The idea is if you go to white roofs and cool-colored roofs that we can dramatically address global warming. We can reduce the heat bounces back up into space, and you reduce air conditioning. A lot of this is more technical than I know. I'm just sort of sharing it with you. The information is pretty dramatic in terms of the savings. And I think if Los Gatos were to take action in this area, that we could be a leader in this fight. Mr. Rosenfeld told me, I believe there's 5 counties in the state that are now required to have white roofs, and I'm not sure if it's residential as well, in terms of cool-colored roofs. And Mr. Rosenfeld told me that in terms of the cost of the paint, it's about 10% more than traditional paints. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherdson. That closes our verbal communications. Moving on to other business. We have our fiscal year 2013-2014 mid-year budget performance and status report for the 6 months ending December 31st, 2013. And I'd like to invite staff to come forward for their report.
Our Finance Director, Steve Conway, and our Finance and Budget Manager, Jennifer Callaway, are coming forward for this presentation.
Good evening, Council. We're excited to present to you tonight the mid-year budget status report for 13-14. We'll go through the outline of what we're going to present to you tonight. We're going to update you on the status of our current year budget, go through the recommended budget adjustments that we've presented to you in the staff report, discuss the 5-year forecast, and the 14-15 budget development process. The first slide here discusses our revenue adjustments that we've proposed for you in the staff report. This is actually the first year, I think, in a few years we have a significant increase in our revenues to propose for you. We're excited that some of our economically sensitive revenues are trending very well for us, so that's good news with the economy turning around. The first increase that you see here is $255,000 in property tax. We've taken this directly from estimates provided to us from the county. And secondly is a $249,000 increase in licenses and permits. This is really primarily building permits, encroachment permits, tree permits, all good indications that the town is doing well in terms of development. Thirdly, we have $233,000 increase in motor vehicle in lieu fees. Again, this is directly taken from estimates provided to us from the county. Fourth is $185,000 in TOT fees. That's a really good sign for the economy as hotel tourism and occupancy hotels is increasing. Finally, $122,000 increase for charges for services. Again, this is primarily planning and building plan check fees. An $84,000 increase in miscellaneous revenues. Most of this is comprised of a Medicare Part D subsidy from the federal government that we were receiving reimbursement for, and a $70,000 increase in sales tax, which is good news to us as we've been presenting to you adjustments downward for sales tax because of Netflix, and we're finally starting to see some increase in this area. We also received some additional grants. It's a $33,000 budget adjustment. This is for the Emergency Management Preparedness Grant and a library grant that we received. We have 3 decreases in revenues, $176,000 in interest income, Again, that's primarily with our LAIF rates. The interest rates just aren't increasing. They still remain pretty low. $125,000 decrease in fines and forfeitures. And finally, a $90,000 decrease in successor agency income. This is the administrative fee that we receive from the successor agency with the wind down and dissolution process. Under ABA 1484, we were allowed $250,000 every year, $125,000 each 6-month period. As the wind down process has continued as is expected, it's less staff time that we're spending, so we only submit reimbursement for the amount of time that we actually spend on the dissolution. We've pretty much wound down. We've received our finding of completion. The long-range property management plan has been approved, so we're spending less and less time on that, and this is just true up what we're actually receiving. Next, we'll talk about our expenditures. Our mid-year expenditures are averaging about 50% of budget. We will probably have, our forecast is showing year-end surpluses due to the increased revenues. We still are maintaining our cost reduction measures that were taken at the initiation of the fiscal year with the adoption of the budget. We do have some police staff and equipment expenditure adjustments that were outlined in your staff report. Primarily, this is the reallocation of positions to create a staff analyst position, to authorize the hire ahead patrol officer position due to anticipated retirements, create a new patrol overstrength position due to some workers' comp, there's absences, and to fund partial radio replacement project. Some of the specific details of the expenditure adjustments. These are just the key adjustments that were presented to you. It's $54,000 increase in expenditures for the special election. We had $46,000 previously budgeted, and we're estimating it'll cost about $100,000 total. $50K for executive recruitments. There's been a large number of retirements and vacancies that we've had to go out for recruitment for that we didn't anticipate. And $28,000 for safety and repairs. Those are all general fund adjustments. We have some other fund adjustments, specifically workers' comp. We're recommending a $345,000 increase from the workers' comp fund. We have about 11 active cases, 8 of which have not reached our $250,000 threshold, which is essentially our deductible. So we still pay on all of those 8 cases, and those are all federal. It's federal law. We have to pay on those. It's not up to our discretion. State law. I'm sorry. $150,000 from the capital reserve for the police interoperability radios, and $113,000 in liability premiums. This is from our ABAG fund, our liability fund, and that's because our premiums as a whole have gone up. We're part of a pool of cities, and as the cities incur more costs, that increases our premiums. And now, do you have any questions regarding that, or we can proceed with the 5-year forecast?
Seeing no questions, please proceed.
Thank you, Mayor Leonardis, members of council. My name is Steve Conway, Director of Finance, and thank you, Jen, for your recap of the budget adjustments. I would like to talk a little bit about our most recent update of our 5-year forecast. We are pleased to note that in our expectation for this fiscal year, if you look at fiscal year 13-14, we have essentially a balanced budget. We expect a small surplus for this fiscal year, as Jen pointed out. Looking forward into fiscal year 14-15, we do show a slight revenue in excess of expenditures, which is a favorable position that you would like to be in for your budget development. And with our updated revenue and expense projections, which are all contained in the most recent update that is shown here graphically, we did update all of our assumptions regarding our future cost increases related to PERS and all of our benefits and all of our expected costs that are part of any MOUs that all those were built into the latest update. So this graph then shows that if you look at the top, the red line with the square boxes, that would be those are our expenditures per the latest forecast. The green line is expenditures modified. You can see that in 15-16 we do show that we're back to where we have approximately a $700,000 problem where our revenues are under our expected expenditures. So we know that we have some budget work to do, or we're anticipating in 15-16 we'll have some budget work to address that shortfall. We anticipate those will be made with permanent ongoing cost reductions. So the green line, which has a 0.7 million number that goes out to the 5th year, that is the green line moderated by a permanent $700,000 change to our cost structure. And if we maintain the discipline of that cost structure, you'll see that we would stay under our blue line, which is our revenues. If we were to make no changes on a permanent basis and solve the problem with one-time funding, then you would see that at year 5 right now we're projecting that our revenues eventually would climb above our expected red line of expenditures. However, it's been our policy to, as we look at balanced budgets, that we would be addressing, and likely in 15-16 with ongoing cost reductions. So I don't think we would be in the top red line situation, but that was more for the public to see how we manage our budgets in the out years. Our focus, as always, will be on the sustainability of our core services. We do expect a small increase or small excess revenue above expenditures in fiscal year 14-15. That's the budget development work that's going on right now. And with our focus on sustainability of the core services, we hope to be able to find some funding availability to address some of the real priority core services in terms of possible extra funding to address some of the core service delivery problems we're having with some, especially in public safety. We're trying to find some revenues available to provide some additional augmentation for those services, which are largely provided by staff. So I'd be happy to answer any questions on the forecast, if the council, or anything regarding the mid-year report at this time.
Questions from council. I see Councilmember Brzezinski.
Just a couple of questions, Mr. Mayor. Looking at your graph again, if you would put that back up. One more. Go back. Easier said than done, huh? Yeah. This is for equipment repair.
Could you push 6 and return?
There you go. So, if I'm reading you correctly, we're going to have an increase in our revenue in this next year, this next fiscal year.
That's correct.
But then we jump back up in 15-16, 16-17.
Yes, we're projecting a gradual recovery of our revenues.
Okay. What's that essentially due to? Since we have a curve down that's in our favor, when we start to curve back up, what is it that's impacting that? What are the changes that additional expenses that we're forecasting here?
Well, it's are you talking about in 15-16? Councilmember Brzezinski, where the red square, you can see that there's a $700,000 gap. What's causing that gap?
Exactly.
Those are largely driven by the benefit costs, which we've built in, which we've had to update for the change to the PERS cost assumptions that were provided to us most recently by CalPERS.
Could you explain the changes in CalPERS ratios?
PERS was meeting this month to address a couple of issues. One was there were a number of issues. The rates that we pay, rates meaning the town as an employer, must pay a certain rate based on every dollar of salary to CalPERS to fund the pension plan. PERS has voted to, or will be voting to recommend some changes to that, which will adversely affect our rates. The primary change will be that PERS is recommending a change in the discount rate. The current discount rate is what PERS assumes the money that we send to Sacramento will be returning over the life of the pension plan. Right now, the assumption is 7.5%, and PERS is expecting to drop that to 7.25. So if the rate of interest or the rate of return on the money that we're sending to Sacramento is earning less, the rates, in order to fund the pension plan and keep it properly funded, the rates will have to be adjusted negatively upwards for us in the future. So we've built that in. That's one factor. Another factor is the mortality rate. PERS had a long-going assumption about lifespan of CalPERS retirees, and people are living longer. There's a recent study completed by PERS which indicates that a longer lifespan means there's longer time span of benefits paid out, which means the fund has to have more assets to make those longer tail of payments. So once again, adversely impacting the rates. And the third, there was another factor which is escaping my mind for a second, but it'll come to me. The smoothing. Thank you, Jen. The smoothing factor. There's a new GASB pension GASB 68 pension plan reporting requirement that will begin effective next fiscal year, which will limit the state's ability to smooth rates. Smoothing rates occurs when you have to make some fairly politically controversial decisions, which is when PERS adjusts its rates, it affects statewide employees. The whole California government is affected by these PERS decisions. So therefore, if rates spike substantially, there's a huge cost to the state of California for that. So there has been an effort afoot in the past couple of years to smooth these rates within a corridor. And if the rate spikes above a certain parameter, the rate is adjusted to stay within the corridor. The PERS GASB 68 pension plan is limiting that corridor and not providing as much leeway. If there's less leeway to adjust a spike in interest or a spike in the employer rate, means the rates will not be capped artificially. So those rates also, which figures 1% to 2% additional on top of the rate we're already paying right now, is in our forecast. So all these combine to cause that red line to jump. All these, because these are the factors built into the new employer rate that we'll be dealing with, that we expect to be dealing with in the future.
Okay. Mr. Manager.
Yes, and per your Finance Committee's request, which is Mayor Leonardis and Councilwoman Spector, for item 3 on tonight's agenda, which was your approval of the annual financial report, we provided an addendum on Friday, which tried to explain as easily as possible, which is not easy, pension liabilities and funding.
Thank you. Further questions? Councilmember Brzezinski?
Yes. On page 2 of the budget performance report, the executive bottom of the left column, as you indicated, the first time in 5 years for fiscal year 2014-15, budget will continue to fund essential public services, as well as focus on relieving workload pressures that have built up over the past 5 years, while budget cuts reduce workforce and workloads remain constant and have grown as a result of improved economy. So we know that we have put a lot of burden on staff to fulfill our expectations as the policymakers. But given the way you project the budget into the future, how much flexibility will we have to do those workload pressure relief activities in the next couple of years, when it looks like we're going to have to remain fairly rigorous in our attempts to be disciplined in how we provide for those services? And I guess at what point in time do we really start looking at increasing personnel in those areas of shortfall that we're experiencing right now?
Thank you, Councilmember Brzezinski. I think we are anticipating some augmentation or some help in fiscal year 14-15, and it's a little easier. I'm conservative by nature, so I will confess to that. The red expenditure line, we can be fairly certain about that line because we have a good handle on what our expected cost increases are. To a fair degree of certainty, I think that red line I would not be surprised if we're fairly accurate. We've been, in the past probably 10 years, been very accurate with where we think our expenditures are going to go. We tend to be a little conservative on the revenue side. We want to see, we're seeing trends in our sales tax, as Jen reported earlier. We're seeing some positive indications the economy is slowly bouncing back, and the blue line, the revenue line, as you can see, if we make a one-time ongoing change to our service delivery, and that could be done through there's technology, there's reorganizations that can occur. There's a lot through attrition. There's different ways of delivering service, partnering with other local jurisdictions. There's ways we're very creative, and we're small, but we're fast on our feet, I'd like to say. And I think if we get to that level, you can see that green line. The good news is, if even being conservative with the revenue projections, if we are nimble enough and make the right decisions, you will see that there is a gap between the blue line, which is conservative right now, and that revised green line, which would say that we've done a lot of those steps and we'll do that work that we need to do to get there. We should have some budget. That gap that you see between the blue line and the lower green line is that surplus that we could then reprioritize in alignment with the council's strategic goals to help with some of this workload impact that you've just mentioned. And if the manager has anything else you'd like to.
Well said.
You're welcome.
Vice Mayor.
I didn't know, Mr. Conway, if this was the time to ask you about, or someone else, about the specific action items that are being requested of us. And if that's appropriate.
I'll be happy to try those,
okay.
Answer those, and then if, I may defer to Jen or.
And it may be really a question for Chief Seaman, because the action items really are police expenditures.
Okay.
So, given what you've said about the projected expenses and Councilman Przynski's indications that we should continue to be rigorous in staffing, I was just curious about authorizing additional funds for a staff analyst. Number one, I don't know what that is. Number two, for hiring ahead a police officer when we have, as Ms. Callaway indicated, workers' comp expenses that we're paying now. And radio updates, if you will, and I wanted to understand how that's different than what we just approved for the interoperability, if it is. And then I wanted to understand from Chief Seaman or yourself what the urgency was for these various items, given that we are unexpectedly being forced to pay $100,000 for an election.
Okay. I think I'd like to address your very first question, which was regarding the staff analyst. That actually, and there's only a small increase in cost. That's actually combining two half-time positions and converting them into one full-time position. So it really isn't a tremendous. I think it's I'm sorry, $30,000 total for the staff analyst, and that was a resource that the department has felt as a critical need. So when we looked at that, that made sense. We think that need filled will provide a lot more opportunity for this department to reach its goals for aligning its cost of service delivery. One of the things as we face these cost increases, we do need to have each department really do a lot of help us get there, and the analyst position I think is critical in that role. For this, a $13 million budget. It's a $13 million operation for PD, and I'll let the manager talk on.
And before asking the chief to go through each of the recommended additions, I did want to be clear: the staff analyst, the police department is providing through reallocation of its existing budget, its 2 half-time positions, for 1 new full-time staff analyst to restore the financial and performance data management of the department that we used to have. So they're accomplishing that through a reorganization, which is how we've tried to maintain services all along. The only 2 pieces of additional funding that are being recommended to you tonight for the police department are both one-time funds, and that is driven by the 5-year forecast you just saw. The police interoperability radio acquisition project comes out of the strategic goal the council adopted last week and formally adopted tonight. And there is an opportunity this spring to take the equipment replacement money we already have, augment it with another 150 of one-time funding this year to achieve 2/3 of that project. And the chief will explain the benefits of that. The additional overstrength position is actually a recommendation for one-time funding to be included in next year's budget. So that would come back to you in your second meeting in May. But we are in the process of hiring officers right now for both vacancies and a retirement that's coming up. We have an exceptional pool of candidates, and what we're finding, as the chief will explain, is with injuries on the job and other injuries that are taking our reduced police staff, it's making scheduling of our 24/7 shifts more challenging. So the one-time use of funds to create this overstrength position through next year, we think help mitigates that risk. So Chief, if you could walk through the 4 additions or 4 changes.
Certainly. Mr. Conway and Mr. Larson did an excellent job making the points that I would make, so I'll just pause for a moment to see if there's a specific area that hasn't been sufficiently answered, and be happy to dive into more detail if it would be helpful.
I'll ask one question. So the overstrength position will be coming back to us in June for our budget adaptation. May, I'm sorry, and adoption in June. And there is no 175 for the current time between now and May.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the other 2 positions are already going to be the funds in your existing budget for 13-14 have already been committed. They're just being reallocated.
Correct.
By elimination and combination of the position.
Correct, except there is a $30,000 additional cost when we go from 2 half-time positions to a full-time benefited employee.
And that's being absorbed in their current personnel budget. They have some savings from vacancies that's absorbing that $30,000.
Okay.
And police department has committed to absorb that this year and in next year's budget.
Okay. Chief, you have a comment?
Yes, to be clear, the terms hire ahead and overstrength have some similarities. Hire ahead means it takes us time to train an officer until they're actually street ready. They're ready to operate as a solo beat officer. It's typically 3 months. If we were to hire the person on the day that a retiree retires, we'd have someone in training and really ineffective for 3 months. So what we're looking to do is hire 3 months ahead of the actual retirement. So that when a person finishes their training program, they're actually ready the day that a retiree goes out the door in the best case. And we don't always hit that precisely, but as we think about hiring ahead, we look at about a 3-month window and the cost of an officer for what the additional cost of the budget would be. We have 2 officers who are retiring this fiscal year, one in June and one in at the end of February, March. We're actually going to hire about equal in time for the officer who's retiring in February, March. So there will be no hire ahead costs, and the department will bear the burden of the training when that officer leaves. What we'd like to do is hire ahead for the officer who's retiring in June, and so we'd have an officer ready to go when they go out the door. The overstrength is in recognition that the department, first of all, is smaller than it has been for many years due to budget reductions and staffing restraints. The officers are working on longer shifts, and the work is intensified, and we have currently 3 officers out on very long-term illness, workers' comp, due to injuries that were suffered on duty. That complicates our staffing. It puts extra pressure on the officers to cover shifts, and so we're asking for one additional person to give us a pilot test through the course of the year to see if adding that extra position to the working schedule relieves flexibility and frees us from having to use overtime to fill those shifts. The department and the town manage the workers' comp payments in a way that the department doesn't have to bear the full expense, and so we have the ability to cover some of those costs. And so the money that's recognized in the budget for $175,000 that will come to you in May will take care of July through the following June of next year, but we would intend to hire a person in this fiscal year, and we would use our existing budget to cover those costs.
Thank you. Vice Mayor, is that satisfactory? Okay. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, as staff indicated, the mayor and I are on the Finance Committee, and independently, we had the same concerns at our meeting, which is with the increasing, with the town's increasing obligation to accrue for post-retirement benefits, PERS and otherwise. Those, to use my layperson's language, those are expenses in our budget, which means they are balanced against our revenue, and they decrease the amount of revenue available for us to spend. I want to thank all of staff for their presentations at the Finance Committee, and also for the memo that was part of Agenda Item 3. They were very helpful. Now, to the question. On page 5, I'm going to this agenda item of your budget performance report having to do with property tax. The statement is made under analysis that the second quarter receipts are trending slightly below those received, blah, 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 blah. And then the suggestion or recommendation is a $255,000 increase in general property tax. So with the trending lower, I just needed an explanation as to why the recommendation is being made for an increase.
Yes, of course. So property taxes we receive primarily in the third and fourth quarter. So we are anticipating to receive more coming forward, and we've taken our projections based on estimates provided to us from the county. So we attend a quarterly meeting with the assessor's office. They provide each of the local jurisdictions with updates each quarter as to what we expect to receive for property taxes, and we've used those estimates.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? I have one question that I will ask now. If we go to page 16 of the budget performance report, and we go down to dot number 7, bullet 7, the credit card merchant fee due to increased merchant expenses with the townwide acceptance of credit card payments. Staff recommends almost $13,000 expenditure to our budget. Could you elaborate on what that means?
Of course. So credit card fees are when a business owner comes in or a builder comes in to pay a permit and they use their credit card. We have to pay a fee on that transaction. As of April of last year, it was against California law for us to charge the person that surcharge for the credit card fee. I'm not aware of any updates. We have sent out some requests to other local jurisdictions to see if that has changed. I don't believe there's any other jurisdictions in our county that do charge a surcharge as of right now. So if we can, we would probably be the first. We have looked at it more as a customer service piece, as well as we weren't legally allowed to charge that back. So we've seen an increase in building permits coming in. We've seen an increase in business owners using credit cards to pay for those fees, and therefore our fees are going to increase.
Thank you. So moving forward, if the council wishes to take advantage of the new law and potentially add this item to our annual fee review, we can consider that moving forward?
If there is, in fact, a new law that allows us to do that.
Oh, currently there. I thought you mentioned something about last April. No.
That was as of last April. There were some emails going back and forth on our listserv, and we were not allowed to. There hasn't been any updates since then that it has changed, but we're looking into it.
Yeah, we this item came up a couple of years ago. We as more and more of our customers are using credit cards. We're receiving a large majority of our payments now through the use of credit cards. We are charged a merchant fee. Everyone is aware that there's a fee that the vendor pays, and this fee is growing as we get more and more use of the cards. And we had actually proposed as part of our our fee update process a few years ago that we would like to look at maybe some recovery of this fee by an additional processing fee on top of the, if it's a $10,000 charge, there might be a $10,100 charge to reimburse the town for its cost for processing. And at that time is when we were going forward, we discovered California is one of 9 states that have passed specific legislation prohibiting us from adding an additional processing fee on top of the charge for the service. That was the information we had as of April of 2013, and we're researching to see if that has changed. And so if there's any wiggle room there to look at that for the future, because that is a cost to the town, and or there's a subsidy to people that are paying cash or writing by check, because they're paying the full amount, and the town receives all of that money. We'll be exploring that.
Simply when the law allows us to charge a service charge, we'll bring that to council for your consideration.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none. I have no speaker cards on this topic. Does anybody wish to speak on our budget? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing and we'll look to council for further discussion or a motion. Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to make a motion, and I will specify each of the sections that are the staff recommendations. The motion is first to accept the fiscal year 2013-14 mid-year budget performance and status report, including the 2013-14 financial projections. At the same time, to authorize the budget adjustments as recommended in the attached second quarter budget performance report, which is attachment 1 in our staff report. And then finally, 3, to authorize the $150,000 in capital funding for expanded interoperability radio acquisition, creation of a police analyst, and an additional one-time allocation of $175,000 for fiscal year 2014-15 patrol overstrength position. And that is it.
And if I may clarify, we did change the wording slightly on the screen that the 175 2014-15, you're not actually approving the appropriation of funds tonight. That would come back in the proposed budget for May and June.
Correct.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second? I'll second the motion. We have a motion and a second. Do we have further discussion? Seeing none, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 8. Update on conditional use permit complaint processes. We have a staff report by Ms. Bailey.
Thank you, Mayor Leonardis and members of the council. I'd like to point out that there is a desk item on this matter, and the desk item contains 2 correspondence from the public. On September 4th, 2012, Town Council held a study session to review the town's code enforcement policies and practices. At this meeting, staff presented information about the town's conditional use permit process, also known as CUPs. On April 1st, 2013, Town Council considered an update on this matter and provided comments regarding community participation in code compliance for CUPs. On September 3rd, Town Council considered another update and directed staff to analyze and report back to Council regarding 3 issues. The first issue deals with recommendations as to how complainants could be advised of their town code rights regarding the process to bring a CUP before the Planning Commission for revocation or for modification. The second item was guidance as to how to handle not opening up an entire CUP for review, as there could be instances where it may be difficult or impossible not to do so. And lastly, I'm requesting guidance on whether or not the Planning Commission should have the option of requiring a periodic review of a CUP. And your report thoroughly discussed these 3 issues. The first issue was public awareness of CUP revocation and modification process. Staff anticipates that the majority of public inquiries and complaints for an approved CUP will be a result from researching the business's conditions of approval on the town's website and or by submitting a code compliance complaint form, which is also available on the town's website. Therefore, staff recommends that the code enforcement and the upcoming CUP web pages clearly define the public steps to request a modification or revocation of an approved CUP. Staff anticipates that the first phase of the CUP web page will be online in the next week or two and will contain restaurants that have a CUP. The second item was limiting scope of a CUP review. As discussed in the previous report on this matter, staff suggested an option that a CUP could be open for reevaluation by the Planning Commission within 6 months or 1 year of commencement to only consider selected issues which were identified during the approval process. At that meeting, Town Council raised a justifiable concern that due to the number and types of conditions of approval, it could be difficult, if not impossible, to determine what conditions relate to the selected issues to be considered. Therefore, based on Council's concerns, staff now recommends that the evaluation not be limited to selected issues as previously suggested by staff. The intent of evaluating a CUP has been to ensure the conditions imposed are mitigating to potential impacts and in some cases to ensure compliance. The intent of the evaluation has not been to reopen the entire CUP for discussion and to determine whether or not the business should cease or significantly change its operation. If during an evaluation the Planning Commission determines that the entire CUP needs to be reviewed, the Commission would then need to direct staff to schedule the CUP for modification or revocation as required by Town Code. If Council concurs with the intent currently used for evaluating CUPs, staff recommends that Council affirm this intent. The last issue was regarding periodic reviews of CUPs. For some CUP applications, town staff or the deciding body has included a condition of approval to initially reevaluate the CUP within 6 months or 1 year from when the business commences operation. As I previously mentioned, the basis for this evaluation has been to ensure the conditions imposed are mitigating potential impacts and in some cases to ensure compliance. In considering this matter, the staff report identifies 4 alternatives for Council consideration for review of a CUP, which are noted on this slide. The first alternative is status quo, no change. The deciding body would continue to determine whether or not to include as a condition of approval that the CUP be reevaluated within 6 months or 1 year from operation of when it commenced, and that would be on a project-by-project basis. The deciding body would also determine whether or not it should be a full hearing or just an informational item to the deciding body. The next 3 alternatives I will be summarizing can be accepted individually, or you can combine them as applicable. That first alternative would be to require that all CUPs to be reviewed except for those items that were approved on the consent calendar. Consent items are typically non-controversial, and they typically have operated without incident. The other alternative could be to require CUPs that serve alcohol. This is typically the type of application that we have imposed this condition for reevaluations. And lastly, to require review if a certain amount of complaints are received in writing by separate individuals within a certain time period. And as an example, a time period could be within 6 consecutive months. So in conclusion, staff is seeking Council comment and direction regarding the conditional use permit compliant process. Staff recommends that Council direct staff to provide the modification and revocation process for approved CUPs on the town's upcoming CUP and code enforcement websites, to confirm the intent of the CUP evaluation by direction to staff, or if Council would like to do a written policy regarding the CUP evaluations, and that they not be limited to selected issues as previously recommended by staff. And lastly, that the deciding body continues to determine on a case-by-case basis whether or not to include as a condition of approval that the CUP be reevaluated within 6 months or 1 year from the date of commencement. As noted in your report, the basis for this recommendation is that the town receives approximately 20 CUP applications a year. The majority of these applications are consent items or non-controversial and operate without incident. Due to staff workload and the number of hearings already before the Planning Commission, staff does not recommend requiring that all CUPs have a condition to be reevaluated before the Planning Commission. In addition, CUP reevaluations could potentially deter CUP applicants, especially those small independent businesses, as this could create an uncertainty with their business planning. And that concludes staff's presentation, and I'm available if you have any questions.
Questions for Ms. Bailey? Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bailey. I just want to make sure I understand the staff recommendation with respect to the second item, the scope of the CUP review. I think what I'm reading, and I think what I heard you say, is that if a CUP came up for review, that it would not be limited to any particular item. It would be a complete review. But what I also hear you saying is that that would not be the hearing to determine amendment or revocation. It would be a two-step process under the staff recommendation, that there would be a review and then there would be a further hearing with respect to modification or revocation. Am I correct?
That is correct. If during the evaluation it was determined that there was an issue, that the conditions of approval weren't mitigating potential impacts, or that the use has created some unforeseen impact, that is when the Planning Commission would schedule it for another hearing to determine whether or not the conditions should be modified or if the CUP needed to be revoked.
Okay. Follow up? I'm curious then why, if there were a CUP that was going to go under an evaluation process, why couldn't it be noticed for evaluation, modification, revocation in order to avoid two hearings? Because people could be confused about, well, I'll come and I'll review this, but then there wouldn't actually be an action taken. You'd have to have another thing that's later on. So why would it be good to have a two-step process versus noticing it for an action on the CUP, which could include keeping it the same, could include a modification, or could include a revocation?
The evaluations that we've had for the most recent applications, there typically has been, it's just been a report to the Planning Commission, and that there has been no issues associated with that. We could amend the town code to change that modification process to encompass all three of those items. That could potentially be a possibility.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question. I'm looking at page 2 of your staff report. The first paragraph, modification, revocation process. Could the, under your current analysis, could the Planning Commission on its own initiative initiate a review of a CUP as opposed to having somebody from the community make that request?
Absolutely.
All right. And to your knowledge, is the Planning Commission aware of this right? And I'm asking that not because there are planning commissioners out there who may or may not know it. I've just never seen that issue come up.
Typically, if there is an issue, a planning commissioner would contact staff on a one-to-one basis and would question, are they complying with their conditions of approval, or I went out there and I don't believe they are complying with their conditions of approval. What would be the next process? And that is where we would let them know.
So at that point, if they took that initiative, they would be advised that you, Planning Commission, have the right to review this CUP.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you. My questions, I think, are for the town attorney. If we were to put a new policy in place that requires a periodic review, would that be retroactive to existing CUPs or only those approved going forward?
Only those going forward. If it was just going to be a typical just review of the CUP on an annual basis, that you'd still have the process that the Planning Commission could do it on an individual basis based on not complying with the CUP. But if you're just going to bring them up as an evaluation each year to take a look at them, we'd need to write that into the CUP.
The right that they have right now
Right.
to do that. And then my second question is, we always are talking about, you have to be so careful with CUPs. They run with the land, which means they run forever, et cetera. One of the pieces of correspondence that we got from the public said maybe we should have CUPs automatically sunset after 5 years or 10 years, something like that. This runs with the land business. Is that something that's unique to Los Gatos? Is that a policy that we can change, or is that a part of a bigger law that we cannot mess around with?
I don't believe it's unique to our town that we allow them to run with the land and they go on forever. Certainly, again, for those that have been grandfathered in, if you didn't have a clause that says it sunsets in 5 years, you can't now create an ordinance that says all CUPs will grandfather in 5 years. But if you wanted to, council wanted to, you certainly could put that in all CUPs to come forward, that they're only good for 3 years or 5 years, or whatever the decision to council would be.
Thank you.
But that would not be the norm.
Vice Mayor?
Wanted to follow up on Councilwoman Spector's question for Ms. Bailey with respect to the Planning Commission initiating its own review of a CUP. You said they would call you. I don't ever remember doing that as a member of the Planning Commission, but be that as it may. Let's imagine a scenario where a member of the public came into a meeting at a verbal communication, not an agendized item, and said, I'm really concerned about X CUP. Does the Planning Commission then have the right to say at that meeting, great, I want to make a motion to have that evaluated at our next meeting?
They could ask that it be put on and be agendized to discuss the revocation and or modification of a CUP.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to go back to the question raised by Councilwoman McNutt regarding the CUP running with the land. That has been constantly an issue for us. When we've looked at a particular application and we feel that this individual applicant is an appropriate provider that we can accept, but when we look forward to the next tenant, the question is called regarding, can we really commit to this particular use in this location for the rest of duration? Or can we call that question at each applicant? And I think that it would be worthwhile for us to investigate whether we have options that we have not executed at this point, or there are other agencies that have initiated the renewal or the initiation of a new applicant for that property with perhaps the same use, but with a new orientation, a new condition that we would put on at that time. I would like to know more if there is a possibility of that, since it has come up so frequently for us as we've decided positions relative to applications.
I would actually have to defer that to our town attorney, because it's always been my understanding, is your understanding, that the CUPs run with the land. I don't think you can modify that.
And again, maybe some research would be necessary, but the only time that I've seen that in other jurisdictions is you'll find that if the CUP lapsed for a 6-month period, in other words, if that tenant was to leave and it's vacant for 6 months, then the CUP would lapse and not be able to be used and would have to come in for a new CUP. So I've seen that language. But typically they run regardless, because you're looking at the use and not the specific tenant. But that doesn't mean that it's not being done out there, and just more research would be needed to look into it.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really think that would be a worthwhile endeavor. I know we have always been told the CUP runs with the land, and as Mr. Brzezinski was pointing out, but if there's any opportunity to get more information on any limitations to that rule that we always thought was the one and only law, I think it would be worth our while.
Further questions of staff? Seeing none, I have one question. I was wondering, previously we discussed putting all the CUPs online, And what is our progress report regarding that? How close are we to getting that done?
Within the next few weeks, we're anticipating of having the town's conditional use permits for restaurants available online. And then once we get those done, we will then implement the other CUPs. What has been an issue with the restaurants, which is the one that has been the most interest to the public, which is why we're pursuing that one first, is that some of the CUPs are so old, they don't have the types of conditions that we have imposed now. So it would actually be more confusing to the public. So we're developing a table for easy reference for the public where they can see what the address is, what the CUP application number is, how many seats were approved for that restaurant, and whether or not they can serve alcohol and whether or not they have outside seats, because not all the conditions on a CUP are that explicit, so we had to actually go and research into the reports and letters of justifications to see what was actually approved. So we think that would provide more customer service to help the public in really analyzing what is approved for that use. But that's anticipated to go online in a couple weeks.
Thank you. Further questions? Councilmember Spector.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. Following up on that, when you say you're putting the restaurant CUPs online first, which I think is a good idea, does that include bars?
That will, yes.
Thank you.
Further questions? Mr. Manager.
Not a question, just going back to the prior discussion. I did attach to the staff report the code sections regarding revocation or modification of a zoning approval, and specifically the grounds for revocation. So your code does address those issues. There are obviously limitations on that authority, giving a vesting of rights and property rights, and that's what staff will further explore with the attorney in the subsequent follow-up.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions at this time, we have one speaker, Jeff Lowridge.
My name is Jeff Lockridge, 109 Paseo Laura. The CUP process is in place to protect the town businesses and its residents from issues of incompatible situations and from potential impacts. I believe the town's focus should be the interest of its citizens rather than primarily on the concerns of the new business. It would be best if both interests could be protected with the CUP, but potential impacts to residents need to be addressed by mandatory enforceable conditions, not another vague interpretation. It's a good idea to have information on CUP information and code enforcement on the website. This also provides information regarding the modification revocation process for approved CUPs. Include only mandatory enforceable conditions of approval. Voluntary conditions are not mandatory, are not enforceable, and do not ensure that identified potential impacts will be mitigated. Establish a review process that can address non-compliance with existing conditions and or requests for revocation for already approved projects, and another process for evaluation, review, and modifications after initial approval of a CUP to address issues that were not anticipated by the original approval or are found to be inadequate to address the impacts identified at the initial approval. The initial approval should be good for 2 years. Renew CUP 2 years after the initial approval to address compliance with conditions, identify issues that may not have been anticipated during the initial approval process or that were unforeseen but were foreseen but not adequately addressed. Consider any complaints received and make required modifications of conditions deemed necessary by the Planning Commission. Schedule a 5-year renewal of permit subsequent to the 2-year renewal review. If no problems have been identified, require CUP to be renewed every 5 years. Depending upon record, approve as administrative action. If complaints are on file, or staff has identified the need to modify conditions, schedule for a Planning Commission hearing. These subsequent 5-year approvals would allow adding conditions if there were a change in business plan or new owners which would result in problems. The length of the initial permit and subsequent permit renewals could be varied by type of CUP based on the identification of types that typically may result in unforeseen problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lee Quintana.
Lee Quintana, 5 Palm Avenue. Actually, I think Jeff said most of what I would have said. I would just like to comment on the question of the initial time period of approval, if that were to be considered. I think that 6 months is not a long enough time to actually find out whether there are problems. 2 years is a longer time that is long enough to allow the business to settle in and not be super conscious of meeting the conditions or whatever, so that at the 6 months there are no problems. 2 years would give a better true indication of if there are any problems. And I think that's about it. I do support the ability of the public to request a hearing. I do support the de novo nature of subsequent evaluations. And there was one other thing that that I think staff report said, placing the information on the website. I am aware, at least in the past, of a jurisdiction that did have a renewal, an endpoint, and having to renew your permit. And it's been a while. I don't know if the laws have changed or not, but it certainly was possible 10, 15 years ago. So that's why I suggested it. I think that's it, unless you have any questions about the comments that I submitted.
Any questions for the speaker? Seeing none. Next speaker is Patty Elliott.
I live at 269 Marchmont Drive, and I'm a neighbor of the Hillbrook School. And I thank you for undertaking this evaluation of the CUP process, because I can confirm, in my view, the current process is not sufficient. For years, neighbors mistakenly believed that the town was requiring documentation from Hillbrook to ensure that the CUP conditions were being followed. Unfortunately, that did not happen. There's been a lack of monitoring and a lack of enforcement of the CUP provisions in the Hillbrook situation. From 2002 until this last year, when I requested it, no one at the town had required Hillbrook to supply evidence of the number of students it enrolls. I asked town staff to require Hillbrook to provide enrollment figures since 2002, and town staff refused, saying that it was not relevant. When there's an explicit enrollment cap in a CUP, why would the town not require the school to provide this information? Similar things have happened with regard to the maximum number of weekend and night activities that the school can host. The town does not require the school to supply a list or schedule of those activities, and lo and behold, when neighbors do the research, we find there's been those maximums have been exceeded numerous times. Likewise, there's a specific provision in the Hillbrook CUP that requires twice annual carpool reports. Hillbrook failed to file those reports 4 years in a row, and we only come to learn that when we requested those reports in 2012, and they did not exist. Similar issues with regard to the third-party use. There's no follow-up, no enforcement of the third-party use that Hillbrook continues to engage in, which is specifically in violation of the CUP. Neighbors should not have to constantly police the CUPs in our neighborhoods. That's the town staff's responsibility. Given the scope of the violations that we've had to deal with in connection with the Hillbrook CUP, the town should implement a process whereby neighbors may request Planning Commission review of the entire CUP, including the town's monitoring and enforcement efforts. There is also the need to tighten up if there is in that process the need to tighten up the CUP language, then that should be done even if the owner has not requested an amendment to the CUP. We've had to bring forward numerous instances where there have been violations and years have passed and we still have not had any clarification or enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more speakers on this subject? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and look to council for discussion or a motion. Vice Mayor.
I'm gonna try a motion, and my motion would be to, I'm not sure how to say this, but going through each of the recommendations from the staff. The first one with respect to modification and revocation process for approved CUPs, to adopt the recommendation for staff that the information regarding CUPs be put online, that a co-compliance complaint form be put online, and that the public be clearly instructed as to how the public can bring in action or cause the Planning Commission to bring in action. And then my only addition to that would be that there would have to be a response to that in a certain amount of time, because I think there's been some frustration by members of the public that they've asked for that and have not received a response. And I don't know how to give that time frame, but I would say at least we have Planning Commission meetings every 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from the complaint, at least response back and an indication how to get that done. With respect to number 2, limiting the scope of CUP review, I agree with my motion would be to go forward with the staff recommendation that the entire CUP be evaluated, and then if it's appropriate to bring a second action for modification or revocation, then that could be done in a second process and noticed. With respect to a requirement for periodic CUP review, my motion would be that we would not change the status quo, but that the Planning Commission be given clear direction that it is in their discretion to set review as appropriate for the particular CUP. I think that the understanding of the Planning Commission now is that they're not really allowed to do that. And I think that we should change the staff direction to indicate that they certainly are, and that is an appropriate thing for them to do as a condition, and that within their discretion, that they should set that time period as appropriate for the particular application. I agree with Ms. Quintana that 6 months is probably too soon to see what's going on, but I don't think a mandatory time period or a mandatory type of CUP should be reviewed, because we've had all types of CUPs that may need to be reviewed, and I can see a mandatory one ending up limiting the discretion to review that. So I'd like it to be within the discretion of the Planning Commission. And then I would like to add as a staff direction to my motion that we get information on how to limit running the CUP with the land. That was discussed by both Councilwoman McNutt and Councilwoman Spector.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 9, which is discussion and direction regarding a town-initiated ballot measure pertaining to development at Albright Way. Looking to staff for a report on this.
Yes, this item was added to the council agenda on Thursday. We have provided you with a very brief staff report, which includes an attachment from the town attorney. We then provided an addendum last Friday with public communication, and then we provided a desk item today that included additional public communication. And staff is available for council direction.
In addition to, I was just received a letter from the attorney for the developers that was just handed to you.
Thank you. Looking to council for questions of staff. Seeing none. Vice Mayor Jensen.
My question is in response to the letter that we've just gotten from Nielsen, Merksamer, Paranello, Gross, and Leone, which is essentially making the allegation that there was a Brown Act violation in bringing a discussion of a countermeasure to council tonight, and it quotes a portion of the staff report. Mr. Larson, the letter says, the mayor, on behalf of one or two council members, contacted town staff Thursday afternoon to request that this item be placed on the agenda for the regular town council meeting next Tuesday, February 18th, 2014. I know that our policy is that the mayor may place anything on the agenda by him or herself. However, if the mayor is not requesting it, it must be requested by two council members. Could you please indicate to us what if your staff report is just indicating the regular procedure and policy of the council, or is in fact attempting to indicate an occurrence in this case?
It follows the town council's adopted policy. As the vice mayor mentioned, either the mayor or two members of council may request something to go on the agenda, and in this case we had both occur, and that is why the item was scheduled.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
I would clarify too that there is nothing that would violate the Brown Act if a council member was to call up the mayor and ask for an item to be added to the agenda item. That is not a violation of the Brown Act by asking. You certainly can't deliberate on it. You can't discuss the merits of the item, but calling or emailing asking for an item to be put on is not what the Attorney General has called deliberating and reaching a collective concurrence by just asking that an item be put on the agenda. So I find no credence in here, regardless of whether the policy states that or whether actually 2 or 3 or 4 council members called the mayor up and asked for this item to be on the agenda. That does not violate the Brown Act.
And to further clarify for the record, the actual item that appeared on the agenda was not discussed with the majority of the council.
Thank you. So, calling up speakers. Oh, Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you. Now that we know that we're going to go ahead and talk about it, I actually would like the council members who requested this to be put on the agenda describe what it is we're doing here tonight, because we have a report coming forward. It's going to be on this next agenda, so I'm not clear on what the purpose of this agenda item is or what our point is that we're doing.
Well, we have a request from one member of council. I received a phone call from a council member who said that they would like to put this on the agenda. I immediately contacted the town manager's office and requested it be put on the agenda. That's what occurred. If the council members wish to speak and answer your question, it's up to those individuals. I just honored the request and brought it forward to the town manager's office. Seeing nobody looking to answer that question at this time, I'd like to call up Cecil Annison as the first speaker.
Good evening, Mayor Leonardis, excuse my voice, Vice Mayor Jensen, council members, Mr. Brzezinski, Ms. Spector, and Ms. McNutt. My name is Cecil Annison, and I live on Willow Hill Court in Los Gatos. First of all, I really do appreciate all the hard work and numerous hours you put in for this wonderful town. I thank you for that. Tonight, I ask all of you for your support in helping to defeat the Albright ballot initiative. By now, we've all read and heard a profusion of statements about this initiative. I believe that you believe now that the developers have been waging a jaw-dropping, unethical campaign, the likes of which I've not seen in the 30 years I've made my home here. Gross representations by hired out-of-town signature gatherers, misleading mailing showing Netflix, Los Gatos High School and students juxtaposed on the same page, and ramping up fear of losing Netflix and school money. May I move this? Who's thanking the town? This was presented by the developers. We support Los Gatos, which was really the developers. This is actually sent by the high school and came in my mail today. Even the colors are the same. Initiative backers, 96% not from Los Gatos, have already spent $250,000 on their SLY campaign. I shudder to think of what they will spend in the coming months before the June election. Wouldn't it be nice if that money were spent on our schools instead of generating misinformation and instilling fear? Until very recently, media coverage hasn't been balanced or even addressed the basic issues that are involved in this initiative. Changing the general plan, capping financial payments to the town, circumventing regular channels by putting decision-making into the hands of one individual, and finally, a 7-year moratorium on any legal challenges as this unorthodox process moves forward. How can residents make an educated choice if they don't know the facts? I urge you, I know that your hands are not tied. I urge you to do everything possible to make a stand on this initiative so that the public can be more informed as to making their decision at the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jeff Loffridge.
Jeff Lockridge, 109 Paseo Laura. I'd like to start by saying that the best course of action to avoid a developer to control our town government, even a little bit, is to submit a town council initiative for the June ballot. I still believe a specific plan version of the existing ordinance 2216 would work the best. I've read that that may not be possible, but every effort by staff should be made to submit one, since staff is responsible for where we find ourselves now with so few options. Back in November, the town attorney wrote a summary of the developer's initiative that describes the initiative as being the same as the town council's approved plan. It is not. I question how carefully she even read the initiative based on her vague summary. A thorough reading by staff of the initiative should have been done then. The impact on the town outlined and a plan put forth to avoid this. Now we have a last-minute deadline that prevents any proactive response. It might even eliminate a reactive response. Staff was definitely not looking out for the town's best interest at that time. I believe a better communication should exist between council and staff. It was an eye-opener tonight when staff knew about the 85 corridor changes, but council did not. When was the public going to be notified? Since I live right by 85. If a town initiative ends up not being possible, I have another suggestion. After last week's meeting, I asked Town Attorney Robert Schultz to clearly define to each of you exactly what your rights are when it comes to making a public stand on this issue, and what you legally can and cannot say. The Los Gatos Town Council needs to come out and take a very public stand on what they believe in. What is best for this town? How will you counteract the developer's marketing campaign? How long before our current attorney composes his own summary? How will you publicize this so that all town residents can see that, based on what they have been exposed to so far, are mostly lies or misrepresentations? How will you protect the town from what the developer is trying to do? Without the oversight of some very concerned citizens, who knows where we would be right now? At the very least, we'd be looking at 85-foot tall buildings and the accompanying traffic nightmares that would create. I believe the time has come for all of you to make that public stand. Please speak out loud and clear for our town. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Amy D.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, Town Council. I'm Amy D., Director of Facilities for Netflix, and I'm here tonight because I'm concerned about the possibility of a town-initiated ballot measure for the Albright Way project and the impact it could have on our project. Netflix has spent a significant amount of money, and my team has spent countless hours on our tenant improvement plans for the new buildings since you approved the Albright project. We need to move into these buildings as soon as possible, so it concerns me when any uncertainty arises around us being able to occupy the buildings next year as planned. I ask you to please compare the We Support Los Gatos initiative to your approvals, and as long as there are no material differences, that you be supportive of the approvals you have granted and the initiative, as it is the only way to create certainty for Netflix. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question for you.
Thank you, Ms. D. You signed leases for 2 of the buildings, correct?
That's correct.
And with respect to the council-approved project, what objections, if any, does Netflix have to the council-approved project?
We have no objections.
Thank you.
We have another question from Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If Netflix has no objections to the council-approved plan development,
sure,
then why not just move forward with that plan development as opposed to the initiative?
So, from my understanding, the initiative will stop the lawsuits, and lawsuits can continue and continue and continue. And so we have a date we need to move in. There's money being spent, still needs to be erected, and so all of these delays would impact our ability to move in the project. There's also dates in the project when things are supposed to happen, trigger points, and delays on that will inevitably cause the developer to not hit those dates.
And that makes sense to me, so then why not settle the lawsuit so that they're dismissed?
So again, we're the tenant, so we lease the buildings, right? So we just want the project to be completed. We want the dates that we've been promised to be hit, and so I think that's been attempted to be worked out. I can't speak on the behalf of the developer on that or the people who brought forth the initiative.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, the next speaker is John Shepherdson.
Uh, 120 Oak Rim. I can speak on behalf of the Citizens Group and to the developers' representatives and to Netflix, and we are prepared to drop the lawsuits if the developer agrees to abide by the town approval. So there you have it. It's right out there. We're waiting for an acceptance. But we haven't heard that, so I'd like to proceed. So in terms of the ballot initiative, we have the sovereign entity of the town, council, manager, community development director. The developer's ballot measure offers us this, that the primary administrator of the specific plan will be the nice Sandy Bailey, which is a changing of the structure. It's a material difference. It's undisputed. This is just a visual. Community development director now will be sending maybe emails to her instead of to the town council advocating what should happen with projects. And I don't think that that's what we want in the town of Los Gatos. And I see a smile from you, Council Member Brzezinski, but I think it would be true, at least in my part, if she's going to make decisions about what is substantial or not, I will be lobbying her. So I understand the developer. They want to maximize profits. It's the Mr. Powell, Sandhill Properties, and the Carlyle Group. Their primary obligation is to maximize profits for their investors. And what they're asking for is less oversight, so they can, I believe, sell those entitlements for more money. We heard that earlier about time-sensitive or time-saving mechanism. So the offer suggests a countermeasure that will keep the town and kids safe and keep Netflix. What do we have as a perfect storm? We have traffic, as we know, is really getting bad in San Jose. It's the worst in the country. It's gotten from the 13th to the 5th worst in the country. If we had an increase in 1 year of 25%. I understand from the VTA materials, normally they project a 1% to 2% increase in traffic. NBC Bay Area, San Jose traffic doubles, worst increase in country. So we're going to have more traffic from these other projects. And we have this study from the California Office of Traffic and Safety that we have the worst in the class for youth bicycle safety, and we're at the bottom 25 for overall traffic. So proposal is keep the sovereignty of the town. Let's go with the 350,000 square feet. We'll keep Netflix. We'll make money for the schools. It's an elegant solution. And thank you.
Thank you. We have a question or two. Vice Mayor first.
Mr. Shepherdson, you opened your remarks by indicating you're prepared to settle the lawsuit and that you speak on behalf of the citizens. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
And you heard Ms. D stand up and say that Netflix was most concerned with going forward, and as she understood it, the lawsuits were holding that up. Can I understand exactly what you mean by dismissing the lawsuits? Because you now have appeals pending. You potentially have additional lawsuits. So exactly what is it that you are offering?
As I indicated before the Planning Commission, we are offering to drop the lawsuits, all the lawsuits, if they agree to abide by all the terms and conditions of the town council approval of 485,000 square feet.
Are there any other conditions that you've opposed on your offer to dismiss the lawsuits?
No.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. Let me preface my question. I am aware of the fact that there are two lawsuits. I am aware of the fact that there are various citizens involved in those lawsuits. I don't know who is involved in what. And I am aware that, that the lawsuits have an attorney. Do you know whether or not your attorney, I don't want your attorney-client communications, but do you know whether or not your attorney has relayed to the town attorney and to the developer's attorney the settlement proposal that you just verbalized?
I really want to be careful in terms of attorney-client communications.
Don't want that. I want to know if your attorney has communicated with opposing attorneys.
They have communicated.
Have they communicated, to your knowledge, the settlement proposal you just made?
Isn't that violating attorney-client communication?
And if that's...
I want to be very, very careful.
All right. Do you have any opposition to a communication to the developer and to the town of the settlement proposal you just made?
Do I have any objection to it?
Right.
No.
All right. I have no other questions at this time.
Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you. I had similar questions, so I wanted to clarify that you are speaking officially on behalf of all of the plaintiffs in all lawsuits. So Ms. Quintana was on the first lawsuit. You're representing her also?
I'm not representing her. That was the first lawsuit. That's a separate lawsuit. That was on the EIR.
So you're not dismissing all the lawsuits. You're just dismissing the ones that you're involved with.
Which are the ones that are pending. She's not involved in any of the present suits.
I think there might still be an appeal out there, but putting that aside, just want to clarify
Yeah,
that.
that's my best understanding that I'm speaking
And then
of.
you understand that the initiative will be on the ballot. It cannot be withdrawn.
I do understand that.
Okay.
I do understand that the developer can take a position that they could publicly take a position that we're willing to accept the town council approval, that they could make a decision not to spend $500,000 or more to try and get it approved. They could. I think the developer could take steps publicly so that that the ballot wouldn't pass. Or secondly, I think maybe I'll leave this up to the lawyers. They could still contractually agree to abide by the terms of the town council approval. So I think that there's ways that it can be addressed.
And that was what I was getting to, was to get more understanding of what agreed to abide by the approved means. So you just described that, and it sounds like it's a job for attorneys to work out.
and parties. I think it takes parties as well.
Okay.
Further questions? Seeing none. Next speaker is Sean Welch.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. My name is Sean Welch. I'm an initiative attorney. I represent We Support Los Gatos. And at the risk of running out of time, I would like to respond briefly to Mr. Shepherdson's comments. First, the settlement that was apparently advanced just now in front of you all in chambers is just not possible. As Councilmember McNutt correctly noted, we have no right, we have no ability as initiative proponents or as the developer to pull the initiative. As a matter of state law, it can't be done. It must go on the ballot. The other thing I just want to say briefly before getting to my comments is that I think we need to wait for the 9212 report here. There's a lot of misinformation about how this project is, or the project is different from the initiative. It's not. Let's get the information before we make some very rash and, quite frankly, dangerous actions by this council that is going to hurt this town. The path that project proponents are pushing certainly advances their own narrow interests, does not advance the interests of the town. It's not in the best interest of the town. Council-initiated ballot measures are always risky. They're inherently risky. Even more so here, where there is very little time. Already, we see pitfalls and risks. Now, I understand it's been addressed this evening. Thank you for doing so in open session. But by trying to do all this on the quick, at the last minute, you have at least the appearance that state laws are being violated, including the Brown Act. There are other issues as well, however, that will be violated. CEQA applies to council-sponsored measures. There's no exception. Unanimous opinion, I think it's been provided by your town council, your town attorney. The Friends of Sierra Madre case in 2001 squarely held that CEQA applies to council-initiated measures, unlike citizens-initiated measures. It's a distinction that has to be very clear this evening. The second, or now, I guess the third now, and again, there seems to be a lot of confusion here, and I want to make sure that we're all singing from the same song sheet, is that in that decision, the California Supreme Court said, and I'll quote, "There's a clear distinction between voter-sponsored and city council-generated initiatives." So again, although voter-sponsored initiatives don't have to comply with formal noticing requirements and things like that we have barriers to the initiative right, council-sponsored members have to. That means in this case, it's got to go to the Planning Commission. It has to be properly noticed, 10 days under Governing Code 65090. There has to be a public hearing before a decision, and then it has to go back to the council after written recommendation. And then after that recommendation, the town council must give the proper notice again, and then it would be legally permitted to put something on the ballot. The town hasn't met these requirements tonight, and there's not time to meet them before the legal deadline to place something on the June ballot. Thank you for considering my comments.
We have a couple questions for you. Vice Mayor.
Mr. Welch, thank you. Mr. Richardson indicated that he was fully aware that the initiative could not be withdrawn at this point, as is the council. That was not his settlement offer. His settlement offer was that he would dismiss the lawsuits in exchange for an agreement with your client to abide by the current and now operative council decision. There's a difference in what you suggested his offer was and what the offer actually was. Would you now stand here and say that you are ready to adopt the council adopted initiative? Ordinance?
I respectfully disagree. There's a difference between let me back up for a second.
So the answer is no. And I'll go on to my next question. The answer is no.
The answer is not no. If the initiative goes on the ballot and a single voter votes for it, the PD zoning will be rescinded. The town will have nothing. We'll have nothing. Netflix will have nothing.
I respectfully disagree. Let me go to the next thing. If you are correct in your representation, which I disagree with, that the initiative is the same as the council-approved project, tell me where the sky bridges are in the council-approved project.
What we've been saying is that there's no material difference. The sky bridges, and If you want to cut me off, that's fine. But I can tell you that the 9212 report will come out. I'm sure the sky bridges will be mentioned.
I don't want to cut you off. I will say that you adamantly stood there and said there's no difference. So there clearly is a difference. My next issue is for the Sierra Madre case, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on it. However, I understood that it had to do with the city council going and taking properties off the historic register without going through a secret process. And that a lot of the analysis in that case had to do with requirements under SECRA for historic structures and keeping preservation of historic structures. Do you see any difference in that context from the context that we have here?
No, CEQA applies. There would be a project under CEQA, and you have to follow its terms. How exactly it would apply would depend on the nature of the initiative. It still applies. And the public noticing requirements apply, all the time periods apply, and there's no way around it. I mean, you have to comply with the law. It's state law. It's controlling.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that my question was covered by the Vice Mayor, but my question was going to be, if the plan development that we approved is the same as the initiative, then would your clients be willing to comply with the plan development as opposed to an initiative if it passed?
The PD zoning is going to go away. It's going to be rescinded by operation of the initiative.
So if the initiative, you said one vote, so if the initiative wins by majority vote, the PD goes away. If the initiative does not win a majority vote, then what happens to the PD?
It remains in place.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Mr. Welch, I have some questions for you as well.
Yes.
So, if the initiative is essentially the same as the town PD approval, we had a speaker from Netflix come forward and said, on with the show. Why did you choose to have this thing circulated if dismissal of the lawsuits was the only goal? Do you realize that by circulating this, and if it passes, you can open yourself up to even further lawsuits, further delays on the project? The citizens group could, or anybody else could go and circulate another initiative, and this could perpetuate forever. The council, when it voted last June, was looking for closure, and they offered the developer a project. And by going out and circulating what's an entirely different project than what was approved by this council, yes, there are similarities, but there are differences. Requesting that this council's original approval be rescinded, I mean, this just kind of perpetuates and delays your cause further, wouldn't you agree?
I do not agree. I believe that the people will speak in favor of the measure. The project will go forward. The buildings will be built. Netflix will remain in Los Gatos, and the issue will be fully and finally resolved.
We have another question from Councilmember Spector.
Not if are you done?
You go first.
Okay, thank you. I understand I don't think you've said it, but other people from the development side have said it, that they wanted the initiative so that they could not have the potential delays inherent with the litigation, the two lawsuits. Why not settle those lawsuits, have them dismissed, and then go forward with the plan development?
Settlement wasn't an option. I mean, this is the first time that we're hearing about settlement is after losses by the plaintiffs. But for the initiative, I'm speculating, but I don't think we'd be hearing about it now. The fact is that we can't take the initiative away now. It's there. It's for the people to decide. It's going to the ballot.
Understood. But why not take the initiative to settle the lawsuits and move forward with the PD?
I don't understand the question.
I understand. We have the initiative sitting over here. You're saying it's going to pass. I'm saying I don't know. But put that aside. Why not settle the lawsuits and move forward with your current PD?
The initiative has to go forward. I don't know how else to say it. If we And I don't think I'm not understanding something.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Vice Mayor.
Let me try, Mr. Welch. Yes, the initiative has to go forward. You now have an offer to dismiss the lawsuits, which many speakers have indicated are one of the primary motivations for putting the initiative forward. The initiative will go on the ballot. It has to go on the ballot. However, it's my understanding that you would have the option, given that the lawsuits were gone, to not advertise, to not campaign, and to put a statement on the ballot that said, this initiative is now moot. The lawsuits that were motivating it have been resolved. Please vote no. Isn't that an option that you have?
Is it also an option to, if it accidentally passes, to say whoops and take it all back? I don't think so. That you're asking us to do the unthinkable. It's not an option.
All right, so I just want to make sure that what you're saying tonight is that, as far as you're concerned, you will not consider the possibility of having the lawsuits dismissed, accepting the council-approved project, which Netflix says it has no objection to, and that you won't.
I'm not going to get into settlement discussions standing here in front of you when I'm not representing the client in that capacity. One, and two, we're getting into what should be confidential settlement discussions in open public.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to tell you what the legal effect is of certain actions, but I'm not.
Okay, I have a direct question, and I think it has a yes or no answer. Are you willing to put a statement on the ballot that says, please don't vote for this initiative, it's moot?
Again, I'm not going to stand here and answer that question. I cannot do so at this time.
Mr. Welch, I'll offer you one more question. Supposing that this council finds merit in adopting its own initiative to compete with your initiative on the ballot, and supposing that the council finds merit in less square footage as presented by members of the public, and suppose that ballot initiative wins, then what happens?
First of all, I don't think it's legally possible for you to put that measure on the ballot. I don't think there's time to do it, and I think you're going to violate state law if you tried to do it. One. Two, you'd have conflicting initiatives, and there's laws that govern that. It would depend on the specifics of those measures. I'm not going to speculate.
So you are not speculating, but you're not saying it's not impossible for that to happen. It can only be challenged after the election.
No, not necessarily, no. There can be pre-election challenges when things are legally infirm.
So assuming that this could occur and there was pre-election challenges, the election still goes forward with your one initiative on the ballot, and that's it? That's the choice that the public gets?
Potentially.
Which is a rejection of the council's approval.
Mind you, Mr. Mayor, I think someone in the audience previously gave comment that this is really late in the game. This could have been done a long time ago. I mean, all these things, the 9212 report could have been ordered months ago. I mean, all these kind of questions could have been resolved. A council could have started working on a measure immediately when we filed for title and summary. Those things didn't happen. And to try and force a countermeasure on the ballot at this late stage in the game is incredibly risky, dangerous, and it puts the town at risk. That's the reality.
Councilmember Spector.
Assuming that the developer's initiative passes, do you have an opinion as to whether or not at that juncture the developer has the option of following through with the plan development or the initiative? And your answer is going to be, if it passes, the plan development's off the table.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, I'd like to call up the next speaker. Thank you, Mr. Welch. Brent Ventura.
Evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. I'm very concerned about this proposal, the initiative proposal, and what it threatens to do to our council manager form of government. I think it's a very dangerous, damaging, threatening precedent. We've had the council manager form of government here in my history in this town for the past 60 years. It served us very well. to anoint a staff member, one who has no accountability to this council, to the public, to anybody except possibly the town manager, to make important discretionary decisions involving this project. These are not ministerial decisions. These are discretionary decisions, okay, that are normally part of the public review process. They're not delegated to a counterperson to approve, to rubber stamp. These are decisions made after public comment, after analysis from the property owners, the proponents, the public, interested parties, the staff. All of that goes away. We're going to have one person deciding all of these contested issues involving design, architecture, landscaping, environmental protection, lighting, off-site appearance, Los Gatos Creek Trail protection. All that's being delegated to one person. Hi, Sandy. And it is not something that I am comfortable with, and I think it's something that this council needs to react to. I don't think we can acquiesce here and say, geez, nothing we can do. This developer's put us in a box here. Well, this developer has a responsibility to this town. They know darn well what they're doing, and they're playing games with you. They're playing you like fools, and they played the good people of Los Gatos to be fools by circulating this thing and not disclosing these relevant material facts. And it's up to you guys, unfortunately, at this point, to stand up and do something. And maybe we can't do something in June, but you sure can do something in November. And we could put other ballot measures on the ballot and have counter initiatives to their initiatives, and this project will get so mucked up, it'll never get built. If that's what they want, give it to them. If that's the way they want to play, give it to them. But we have a functioning town government here that has worked very, very well. And is it going to come to the point where we're going to have our community development director filing FPP statements so we know that their bank accounts are not being enriched by this developer? Because the council has to do it because we have accountability. There's accountability at the ballot box, and we know what's going on in your bank accounts. We need the same thing if we're delegating a staff person to make these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Andy Wu.
Let me adjust this since I forgot last time. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'd like to extend a congratulatory welcome back to Councilmember Spector for a quick recovery. I wasn't originally going to speak tonight. I didn't prepare a script. The only reason I stood up is because Ms. D from Netflix said something that incensed me, and it incensed me a lot. She said that Netflix wanted certainty, and I can understand that from a business perspective. But if they wanted certainty, then they could have, back in November, made certain that the ballot initiative mirrored the council's approval. They didn't do that. I'm sure they had input into this because they made a comment that they didn't want to get involved in a lawsuit. They didn't want to be involved in a ballot measure. They could have had input, and I understand that although the town, according to the town's attorney, Mr. Schultz, can't mirror its own legislation in putting forth a ballot measure, the initiative process doesn't have that prohibition. So Netflix and the developer has created their own uncertainty. For them to now come up and say that this uncertainty is what they're trying to avoid, well, that's just offensive to me. Let me just pull back and say something. Mr. Shepherdson's offer, when he made it, probably wasn't completely genuine because I'm the other plaintiff and I need to concur in that offer. I concur in his offer. There is no quid pro quo. We're not asking that the developer do anything different than simply follow the town's approval. That is it. As far as what Mr. Welch said, and I know I'm prohibited from discussing the contents of settlement discussions because we had a non-confidentiality clause. However, I can say to the council that back as far as November, we had settlement discussions. Those fell through because of, well, a refusal to budge from position. I'm not blaming anyone specifically for that happening. We are where we are now, but there's a chance, an opportunity to make things right that will depend on what the developer and Netflix are willing to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Lee Quintana.
Lee Quintana, 5 Palm Avenue. I was not going to speak on this item tonight, but I do want to make a couple of statements now. One of them is to clarify that I was the named person on the initial lawsuit that challenged the negative declaration. When that case was settled to the favor of the citizens of responsible development, when the group decided to continue with the lawsuits, I removed my name from the lawsuit. I was not in favor of continuing, not because I didn't believe in what they were pursuing, but because I was concerned about the risk that it was being taken as to the consequences of it. I didn't know what those consequences could be, but I was concerned there would be consequences. And in fact, the consequences of filing this initiative were far greater than anything I could have imagined. So I want to make that clear. Secondly, there are major differences between the PD and the initiative. The one that concerns me the most is the one in how it's implemented. I'm not, and I didn't prepare for this, so I'm going to be a little bit. The way it works normally in the town, as my understanding, is that you have a PD, you have an approval. If a modification is requested, there is a determination whether it's substantially consistent or not substantially consistent, and depending on what it is, it either gets approved by the director, DRC, or sent to the commission. That's the normal process. If it's substantial and it goes to the commission, it usually requires an amendment to the PD. In this case, the implementation measures that are written into the initiative bypass some of that. They put the power with the director to approve. I'm going to do this real fast. If there's not a substantial difference between the project and what the approved specific plan and the project, the director can bypass, or the initiative forces him to bypass the A&S process, and it goes straight to a building permit. If it's a substantial difference, it requires A&S, but the initiative exempts it from requiring an amendment to the process. So you have two different ways of doing it and two different ways of changing it.
Thank you. That is the last card. Looks like we're having someone come forward to speak.
My apologies. I submitted a single card with 2 items on it, so I apologize if that didn't get that. So again, Margot Bradish on behalf of LG Business Park LLC. And first thing I'd like to do is actually submit a second letter that addresses the legal issues addressed by Mr. Welsh. I'd like to address, in addition to the legal issues that you've already heard, some of the practical reasons that the town should not place a countermeasure on the ballot. First, I know there's been a lot of discussion about this tonight, but the initiative does substantially implement the project that the town has already approved, and the contentions to the contrary are just false. You will be receiving a 9212 report with documentation from an independent consultant retained by the town, and we're confident that it will confirm that they're substantially the same. The initiative was only put on the ballot to avoid substantial delays associated with the litigation and to provide certainty to potential tenants of the project. The opponents have already filed 2 lawsuits challenging the project. They lost them both. They've appealed them both. The initiative would put an end to that. As a result, there's no need to have a countermeasure at this point. Second of all, the countermeasure is guaranteed to confuse the voters. It's confusing everyone already in terms of the project and expose the town to significant cost and litigation risk. The countermeasure would have to, by law, propose a different project than what the council has already approved. You can't reapprove that. Your town attorney has already opined on that. And so then the voters aren't going to know what they need to do in order to uphold what you've already approved. If the voters are successfully confused by that and the countermeasure prevails over the initiative, you're almost certain to get a legal challenge, either a legal challenge on the basis that Mr. Welch already articulated, or more importantly, the project opponents themselves who have already filed litigation could turn around if the countermeasure prevails over the initiative and challenge the countermeasure for the very same reasons they've challenged the project that you've already approved. All those same issues could be raised with respect to the countermeasure. In the meantime, the project that you've already approved would be delayed. The community benefits would not come to pass. The prospects for Netflix staying in Los Gatos would be diminished, and you would have incurred substantial cost to put the measure on the ballot as well as to defend it. Finally, there's no rational basis at this point for reversing your prior approval of the project and now support a measure for a different project. The continued opposition by a group that was already heard at your council hearings doesn't change that. There's no new basis here for changing your decision. So in summary, we really urge you not to get drawn into a costly and controversial initiative campaign that would jeopardize the project that you've already approved. The process that's already underway with your 9212 report will confirm that the initiative implements the project that you've approved. So a countermeasure is not only unnecessary but really ill-advised under these circumstances, and we'd urge you not to place it on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bradish. Do we have any questions? Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You just said that a counter initiative would jeopardize the project we've already approved. Why would that be?
So under the election law, as already provided to you by your town attorney, the countermeasure can't reapprove what you've already approved. That's not a valid basis for a town to initiate a countermeasure. So you'd have to put something different on the ballot than what you've approved. And there's law that would address how substantially different that would have to be, but it would have to be a different project. So when you put that different project on the ballot, you're going to have the initiative that's already been qualified for the ballot, which, as we've said, we believe your 9212 report will confirm substantially implements what you've already approved, or a different project, whatever, we don't know what it would be that you would put on the ballot. If you put something different on, we don't know if that would be feasible. We don't know if it would be acceptable to Netflix. We don't know what it is. But it would certainly create confusion and further delay and likely additional litigation, and we believe that would jeopardize the project.
And why would it create further delay?
You would have two ballot measures on in June. If the countermeasure passes, it is almost certain to be subject to litigation. Litigation that, for the reasons that Mr. Welch has identified and other reasons, has a legitimate potential for success. We don't believe there's really any successful basis for challenging the initiative measure that's already qualified for the ballot. It followed all the proper procedures. It's addressed the issues that have been raised in the litigation. We don't believe there's any basis for a successful challenge. I think a countermeasure would be subject to a potentially successful challenge, and that could draw things out for a lot longer.
Because a countermeasure, by definition, would be unacceptable?
No, because the countermeasure at this point would have legal deficiencies, including the ones that Mr. Welch mentioned, noncompliance with CEQA, noncompliance with the planning and zoning law that's applicable to the town-initiated measure.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Thanks. I just want to make sure that the potential litigation that you're talking about would come from LLC Business Park or Los Gatos Business Park, correct?
Not necessarily. No, I'm not standing up here threatening litigation in any way, shape, or form. It could come from any party who objected to the town placing a measure on the ballot that hadn't complied with the proper procedures. And as I said, in addition, it could come from the project opponents themselves. The initiative measure presumably would suffer from all of the same infirmities that the applicants alleged your existing approvals would suffer from. And the whole point of the initiative measure was to take all that off the table and get the project moving forward once and for all. If they were successful in defeating the initiative measure and approving a countermeasure, there's no reason they couldn't turn around and then challenge that too and just try and go back to square one and stop everything. And you'd be paying the cost of defending that litigation.
Ms. Bradish, based on what you just said, I heard a settlement offer here this evening. Now, the council approved a project for Albright Way. You brought, or the Los Gatos Business Park LLC brought forth an initiative, which was a different project. If the council decided to put yet another project on the ballot, wouldn't that be ultimate democracy? The people would, in effect, have more than one choice. What you're advocating from a position, being a representative of the developer, is kind of like too bad type of thing. There's nothing you can do. Take it or leave it. I mean, I see complete inflexibility and an attitude where here we are as a council, we struggle with this project for going on 4 years and 4 mayors. We got an approval last summer, and I don't find credibility in the argument where you guys circulated an initiative, spent more than $250,000 up through December 4th just to settle some lawsuits. I just don't find any credibility in that. I think by submitting an entirely different project, as you did, your real motivation for sending this through is to get a better project and better terms and more entitlements. Can you respond?
I'm not sure if there was a question in there somewhere, but let me try and respond to the concepts. First of all, as we've said, the initiative is not an entirely different project, and with a little forbearance here, you will get a 9212 report and a report from an outside consultant that will confirm that. It is not an entirely different project. It implements the project that you've already approved. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is that the initiative was put on to address the litigation and the time, really, because, as you've heard extensively, Netflix is under a tremendous amount of pressure to find space, and we need to get underway in order to provide that to them in a time frame that meets their needs. So the initiative is intended to implement the project that you approved. It is intended to meet Netflix time frame and to satisfy the initiative. You know, we could have come back and put an initiative on the ballot that asked for the square footage we had originally requested, or a mixed-use project, or other things that the council had rejected over the years. We didn't do that. We didn't do that because the goal was get rid of the litigation and implement the project that the council has approved. In terms of settlement offer, I really can't comment on settlement discussions that may or may not have occurred as a result of confidentiality requirements. I would say that the offer that was made here tonight has not been communicated, to my knowledge, prior to tonight. And I would say also in response to that, that the inflexibility that you may be sensing is not coming from a choice. It's coming from a legal structure that we don't have the ability to flex. The law is very clear that once that initiative measure initiated by citizens of the town, gone through the proper process, qualifies for the ballot, it will be on the ballot. We cannot agree by contract, as suggested by Mr. Shepherdson, that even if it passes, we'll comply with the old PD zoning, because the PD zoning will be gone and the initiative will be the law of the land. We can't choose contractually to comply with that any more than we could contractually choose to put a commercial building in a residentially zoned area in the town. It's just simply not permitted. So we have to comply with the initiative if it passes. Could we not campaign for it? I suppose it's a technical possibility, but it would be asking us to take a tremendous amount of risk with respect to the prospect that the initiative would pass anyway. And I'm not sure where that would leave us. You know, and at the risk of, I don't want to get into any confidentiality provisions, but I don't know for a fact whether the folks who have appeared before you today have authority to bind all of the parties who have been involved in this matter. It's an unincorporated citizens group, so I can't answer that question as we stand here tonight, but that would certainly be a concern.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest the same to you as I did to Mr. Shepherdson. This is a good thing for the attorneys to be talking, the litigation attorneys to be talking to one another, not the parties in council chambers. You said that it would be a tremendous risk not to campaign. Why do you say that?
If we settled this lawsuit, speculating here, not having a settlement discussion, if we settled this lawsuit and agreed that we would comply with the PD ordinance, and we didn't campaign for the initiative, and it passed anyway, we're done. We can't comply with the PD ordinance anymore because it's gone. We can't comply with the initiative because we have a contract that says we'll comply with the PD ordinance. We've got nothing. I don't see how we can take that risk.
And you don't see the potential for doing a contingent type of settlement? Or a settlement in the alternative?
You know, this is the first tonight we've heard of this. It hasn't been discussed. I can't speak on behalf of my client as to what might be possible, or again, whether the parties who have appeared before you tonight even have the authority. So I understand the desire to settle. It is not something that I think everyone in the room might not share, but we're very hamstrung by the initiative measure now that it's on the ballot.
Let me just say, I think you're very informative, and that's why I'm asking you the questions I'm asking you. You're very helpful. I mean, I'm sitting here, quite frankly, really disliking the lawsuit, really disliking the initiative, okay? And so you have been providing good information. You might not be able to provide the answers, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Glad to be helpful. Thank you.
Any more questions for Ms. Bradish? I have one final question for you. You keep referring to the approval by council of June of 2013 and the initiative essentially being the same. If they are the same, and the main goal was to strictly dismiss the lawsuits, why are you asking us to change the zoning?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How are we asking you to change?
Your initiative changes the zoning?
Right. So in order to address all of the issues that have been raised in the various lawsuits, we came up with a structure that we believe creates a project that is essentially the project that you approved, but in a format that's immune from those challenges.
If the initiative overturns the lawsuits by nature of the initiative, why do you have to change the zoning also?
We wouldn't want the initiative to be subject to the same litigation challenges that were brought against your approvals. So we created a structure that authorizes the same physical project, but protects the project from the claims that have filed in the litigation. Now, mind you, the town was successful in winning both of those lawsuits at the trial court level. We believe the town will be successful in winning both of those lawsuits on appeal if that's where we end up. So we don't believe that there is a deficiency in the existing entitlements. We believe they're entirely adequate and defensible. But because they've been challenged and because we don't want to have that same lawsuit again a few months from now, we created a structure where those issues are just simply not even factually applicable.
Councilmember Spector.
Because there are thousands of people listening to us chat tonight, okay? I just want to make it clear, because several people have mentioned both lawsuits being lost by the citizens. The first one was actually the citizens prevailed in requiring an environmental impact report. And then once the developers did the EIR and you went back to Judge Huber, then Judge Huber found the EIR acceptable. Is that?
So that's actually a third lawsuit. So the original lawsuit that you're referring to was to challenge the town's initial approval of the project based on a mitigated negative declaration. Correct, as Ms. Quintana mentioned, the citizens did prevail in that litigation. The town went back then and prepared an EIR. The citizens challenged on what's called a return to writ, so the court already had jurisdiction because of the prior litigation. They challenged that. Judge Huber found in the town's favor on that CEQA lawsuit. So as that currently stands, the EIR has been upheld. That is now currently pending on appeal. The citizens also filed an additional lawsuit against the town, which was a challenge under the state planning and zoning law. Judge Huber also found in the town's favor in that litigation. That litigation has not yet been appealed, but the citizens have made public statements that they intend to appeal that decision. So the two lawsuits that I was referring to were the two, not the original NAGDEC lawsuit, but the EIR lawsuit and the planning and zoning law lawsuit.
Further questions? I said I had one more, but I got one more.
I've got all night.
Okay. We don't, but. So, would you agree with me that the change in zoning represents a material difference in the council's approval versus the approval proposed in the initiative? Assuming the square footage is the same, and assuming that the bridge, which is in your initiative but is not in the council approval, let's just pretend that isn't there, is the zoning a material difference between the two projects?
No, not from the standpoint of the physical project that you've approved. With the exception of the bridges, the physical project is the same project. The structure for getting there is different, so it's a specific plan instead of a PD zoning for a variety of reasons, attempting to address any potential concerns raised in the litigation. But no, the project is fundamentally essentially the same.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes the public testimony. And now we'll go on to council for discussion. Vice Mayor.
Thank you. I had questions for Mr. Schultz, and I know that you have looked at this and analyzed it, and we've had this on the agenda to talk about a potential initiative. So as I understand it, the town under 9222 could put on an initiative to enact an ordinance, repeal an ordinance, or amend an ordinance. So my question is, how substantial would the amendment need to be in order to qualify? Because one of the lawyers indicated that there's law out there for how substantial it would be. So I'll give you a hypothetical. The town does an ordinance which is the council-approved project, except that it says, under no circumstances shall there be a sky bridge. Would that be an amendment that would qualify under 9222?
Yes.
And then going further with my hypothetical, if there's an approved EIR out there for a project that, however, didn't include sky bridges but include everything else, why is it under the law that the town could not rely on that prior EIR to comply with CEQA in proposing its own initiative?
It could very potentially rely on the CEQA that was done before and under that circumstance.
And my final question is, I know that you have done an entire timeline to figure out what legally the town would be required to do should it decide to put forward an initiative. And I'm not saying that's a good idea or a bad idea, but what are the time limit constraints on the town council doing that?
The town council has a drop-dead date of March 7th that the resolution has to be to the county with the resolution, with the ballot title and language on that date. As far as complying with CEQA and the government code regarding public notices and public hearings, you've heard the comment and concerns from counsel for the developer. Those certainly are a concern of mine also, but I've also seen where cities have put the measure on and used the CEQA from previous EIRs as coverage. And so that's what council would have to do if it was going to, was rely on the previous CEQA document and also rely on the fact that the public noticing requirements don't need to be met under these circumstances, because actually the voters will be deciding that, and there's months before the election, before that hearing will be held on the election date. So you'd be relying on those. The difficulty is just the risk with coming up with the correct language and making certain that voters aren't confused, that then develop into, as been mentioned, litigation. And I've said that preparing ballot measures is measured in months, not days, and you're requesting it be done in days. Certainly, if there's a majority that wants to move forward then my recommendation is to, appoint an ad hoc committee and to really roll up your sleeves and find out what language, instead of just saying no bridges, answer that, yes, that's an amendment, but your approved project doesn't allow for bridges to begin with, so you're putting in a negative of something that's not allowed anyways for that amendment. So we have to really figure out what language we'd actually put in to accomplish what I understand you're trying to state.
I'm just using that as a hypothetical, so I'm just trying to figure out how big the change would need to be and what nature it would have to be. Could you just, for my benefit, I know that there's a noticing process for CEQA which requires a 20-day public comment. You had given us a timetable, and then there's a 10-day noticing period. There's also the time to put an analysis on the ballot. So you're doing an analysis right now of the existing initiative. You'd have to do another one. Am I correct? I'm just trying to figure out what all of the legal and practical constraints there are for us doing our own initiative.
So there is a requirement under CEQA. If you follow CEQA to the exact language that's required, there is a 20-day noticing period under that, and there's also a noticing period under the government code for ordinance approval of 10 days plus publishing, which you cannot possibly make those deadlines and put an initiative on the March 7th ballot. I'll give you an example. Sales tax initiative. The Board of Equalization takes the position that you have to follow those noticing requirements prior to putting a sales tax initiative on. So you have to do the public noticing. You have to do the 2 readings in the ordinance before the Board of Equalization will allow you to put that on a measure to increase your sales tax. But there's countless of other measures when it's not dealing with the Board of Equalization that doesn't require you to put that 20-day period under CEQA, doesn't require you to do the 10-day noticing, and allows you to pass the resolution that only has the ordinance amendments attached, and that would be your document that would have to be done by March 6th and rely on the CEQA and rely on no noticing requirement whatsoever. Does that open you up to a legal challenge? It probably will. But it has been done, and there's really no case law out there at this point in saying, yes, you have to follow CEQA. What does that mean to the noticing requirements? Certainly, we would have to use our CEQA document, which we have done as an EIR.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've heard a lot of issues bandied about, some of it hyperbole, some of it less than accurate, and I think we asked that the staff come back with a 9212 report that was going to talk about the substantial differences, if any, in our June ordinance versus the initiative. I've heard the words entirely different project stated a couple of times, and I think that is not how I see it. I think there are differences, but to say it's an entirely different project, I think we have to wait till we get the 9212 report. If we don't get the 9212 report, then we can make up whatever we want. But I do believe that we have to be cautious about that. I also think that we have to be open to all sides and not be too aggressive in our response to what we've heard tonight. I think what we need to do is take a step back and take a look and study whether this is really the issue that we want to deal with right now. I don't know whether Mr. Shepherdson represents anyone more than himself, Mr. Wu, or other parties that might bring suit, but I understand the reason why the initiative was brought forward is so that it could prevent any of that from happening, no matter who the parties are that might bring suit. I agree with the former mayor, Councilwoman Spector, that I'm not pleased with either side. I thought we made a decision in June. It was the right decision. I'm not interested in changing that decision. I think that for me, that's how the democratic process works. We're your elected representatives, And I would like to see us move forward with that. I think there are good cause for doing that, and I think we made some very difficult but appropriate decisions here. So in order to change the project substantially for a counter initiative, I don't see how we could do it. I don't see how you can say we'll eliminate sky paths or whatever we're calling these bridges when we didn't approve them in the first place. So that does not seem to be a significant change from what we already approved. We would have to come up with something significantly different. And as this council member, I'm not willing to change what we worked so hard on back in June to close this argument. I distinctly remember our decision was we want to see this again. We want, those non-substantial changes to take place at staff level and before A&S. So with that in mind, I'm not really inclined to move forward to study a counter initiative given all the time constraints, but more particularly given the fact that the election code, as our attorney outlined for us, makes it really clear that unless we were putting up a substantially different project than what we already approved, then we really can't go forward with that. Okay? And if that's the case, then I don't see how we have an opportunity, no matter how much there is an interest, to move forward with a counter initiative. My interest is in clarifying this initiative process so that we can have an informed electorate in June. I think that's what our people are asking for. They want to know what this is about. And that's what our 9212 report is supposed to tell us. So for my purposes, we need to wait till we get that report. At that point in time, we can see if there's any direction we need to take, whether it's for us to either support or act in opposition to the initiative as a council or as members of the council. But to me, that really is the issue. So from this council person, for direction to staff, I don't see moving a counterbalance measure as appropriate at this time.
Further discussion. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This probably is going to go to Mr. Schultz over there behind Mr. Brzezinski's arm. I have listened to you and I have read your materials, and I understand that a council initiative can be challenging substantively and procedurally, correct? But I haven't heard you say it's not possible. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
What would, from your point of view, why wouldn't the council move forward with a request for a council initiative to be reviewed at our next council meeting, March 3rd or whatever it is? Because to not take that step means that we have totally given up on the council initiative process. So why not do it? And trust me, I am listening to you very attentively.
I'm not telling you not to do that. What I'm telling you is that that takes a tremendous amount of time over the next 2 weeks and guidance and direction. I wouldn't know where to begin on starting to write that amendment to our ordinance or that ballot language without direction. So that could go through, many revisions before it would come out at the end. But I'm certainly capable of taking on that tasks, but we'll need tremendous guidance, as the other council member mentioned. A hypothetical about the bridges, I just can't start pulling a ballot measure together without direction. And that's how do you accomplish that direction in such a short period of time?
All right, so we have a time challenge in this instance. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Schultz, we got 24 days between now and March 7th. So, in your wisdom or your recommendations, and considering noticing requirements, supposing we're going to rely on previous CEQA material, if the council chooses this option to put forth another initiative, what is the proper noticing that's required in order to get that done by March 7th? Can it be done in 24 days?
Just to make sure we're working on, I believe it's 16 days?
It might be. We're a couple hours away.
So in order to put this on your March 3rd agenda, you would be looking at the Friday before having that resolution completed. Right?
There could be a special meeting scheduled for the 6th, which then would require the resolution to be the 5th, if it can be done on a special meeting.
So by February 28th?
Thereabouts.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Brzezinski?
If I'm correct in reading what the Election Code 9222 says, at what point would the council meet publicly to discuss the changes in the project we approved in June that would be substantial enough to make it different than the project already approved? Just curious how we would do that, because I would assume that there would have to be some kind of noticing about our interest in changing what had already been approved in terms of any parts of the project itself. And it's not a rhetorical question. It's a real question. How would we go about that process?
Mr. Schultz, do you have an answer for Mr. Brzezinski?
So the position, if council was to put a ballot measure on the initiative, the noticing requirements under CEQA and the noticing requirements in the ordinance law, our resolution would say do not need to be complied with, because the ordinance that's attached to the resolution would not go in effect until the voters' approval in June. So that is your noticing requirements. But again, I go back to not the fact of the public participation, but staff's ability to draft something when it doesn't have direction on what those changes are that you're looking for.
Mr. Schultz, could the council at any time schedule a meeting with proper notice to the public if it so chose to answer Mr. Brzezinski's question, to revisit the terms of the original project and change those terms for the purposes of a competing ballot initiative?
You can hold special meetings with 24 hours notice.
Thank you. Councilmember McNutt.
I'm really disturbed by this conversation because we talk a lot, all of us, about transparency and wanting our community to be involved and really understand issues. There is no way there's not going to be mass confusion about this initiative, even if there's just one initiative, because it is so unusual to put a second initiative on there. I don't understand what it would be or what its purpose would be. And if we're talking about an informed electorate, that's going to take that confusion and ratchet it up exponentially. If our purpose of this discussion is to try to protect council's original decision on the PD, it seems to me that once we get the analysis of the report, and if the majority of the council is uncomfortable with what that report shows that the initiative would put forward, then the best option would be then for whatever council members want to come out publicly against that initiative, to campaign against that initiative so that it would lose and the original PD would stand. This is far too complicated to be trying to do this in this rush, helter-skelter way. It's just, in my opinion, totally nonsensical, and it doesn't protect the town, it doesn't protect the project or the council's previous decision. So there is no way that I am in any way supportive of spending any more time, staff time, pursuing a second initiative for the June election.
Thank you. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, there's certainly don't disagree with what Ms. McNutt said, but I still have questions of staff. Again, probably Mr. Schultz. What do you see as the staff's process in the next 2 weeks if the council wanted to explore a council initiative that was consistent with its plan development and under the umbrella of the existing environmental impact report and consistent with the limitations of 9222? How do you see that being pursued by staff?
The process would be to look at the ordinance that was passed by council and look at specifically the project that's on the initiative and try to craft language that would carve out language out of the specific plan that you were trying to eliminate and put that into your amendment to your ordinance. Whether that would still fall under CEQA, I don't know until that language would be crafted. It's a very tough task if that's what you're trying to do, and this goes to Councilmember McNutt, is what are we trying to accomplish without confusing the voters? If what you're trying to do is preserve your original ordinance, and then I think the first step is to figure out exactly, try to come to an agreement of what are those changes and which changes are not acceptable to council. And how do we put those changes in an amendment to ordinance so they do not occur?
Is that analysis parallel or totally consistent with the one that's already being done by the 9212 report that Mr. Brzezinski mentioned?
That's exactly what's being done right now.
It's parallel to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Schultz, I heard Ms. Bradish refer to outside consultants providing advice about the 9212 report. There seems to be a great knowledge coming from the supporters of the initiative being directed in the public comments towards the council about all these wonderful things that are already occurring that we may not be aware of. Can you enlighten us as to who may be assisting you currently in getting the information for the 9212 report?
As I've explained to council in my weekly items, we've engaged a consultant who is writing and doing the research for the 9212 report. And they are being assisted by myself, the town attorney, Sandy Bailey, and Joel Paulson.
Another question. Looking at the March 3rd date, suppose we get the 9212 report that evening, and suppose the council at that point in time decides to do one of several options, which would be one, to adopt the initiative as it's written. One would be to come up with a competing initiative. One would be to do as Councilmember McNutt suggested, where they decide to take the information and form an opinion for or against the initiative. The date of March 3rd, does that allow enough time by March 7th for the council to prepare within those 4 days a competing initiative? That's the problem. I think that therein lies the issue and why this meeting may have been called this evening, or this item may have been agendized this evening.
I'll answer a narrow piece of that, and then I think the town attorney can answer the balance. The current schedule, and it's a very, very tight one, is to get the 9212 report to you in your normal packet that's delivered Thursday before the meeting. That's the schedule we're working for, just because we thought that would be best for the council and public transparency.
Mr. Schultz, were you going to comment as well?
And certainly if I don't feel there's enough time to adequately do a measure currently, not from a legal standpoint and from a procedural standpoint, just from a timing and making sure that we don't open ourselves to litigation. I certainly don't, March 3rd, my opinion won't change. I mean, from, again, months is what you normally see. If you were to begin this process right now, and I told you, I'd probably tell you November on the ballot would be cutting it short by the time you need to really focus on the language that you're going to put to the voters and how it is going to affect your original project, and making sure it won't be susceptible to CEQA challenges or any other challenges that might be out there. So it's a risky proposition, but certainly if council wants to, staff will move forward and work on it.
And I just wanted to kind of make that same statement on behalf of staff. Clearly there's a council majority interest in seeing if a alternative ballot measure might be possible under the significant legal and timing constraints faced. I think, there's CEQA issues that would have to be avoided, so anything that's a development change is not possible. There are noticing issues, so you get to what's left is financial or procedural that would have to be considered. And I think the only way that could be done in the time frame, and it may not meet the timing restrictions or legal restrictions as outlined by the town attorney, would be an ad hoc committee and multiple special council meetings.
Vice Mayor.
To the extent, Mr. Larson, that you're counting me as one of the majority, I'm not. I'm waiting for the 9212 report. I asked my questions of Mr. Schultz to make sure that the council and the audience and everyone else knew exactly what the time constraints were and exactly what the legal constraints were and exactly what the concepts were for my information.
Thank you for that clarification.
Councilmember Spector.
And I'm a council person who's trying to keep our options open, or the town's options open. But what I hear is if we wait for the 9212 report on March 3rd, our ability to put a council initiative on the ballot is basically zilch. And if we move forward now with at least a consideration, an exploration, we would have a difficult time. But 2 more weeks from now, it will essentially be an impossibility. Is that, I'll ask staff, is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization.
Okay, thank you.
So based on what Councilmember Spector just said, I'd like to go ahead and make a motion that this council choose to nominate an ad hoc committee to explore the idea of putting a competing initiative on the ballot. Maybe that ad hoc committee will find merit moving forward, maybe they won't, but at least that option will remain open. And I think it's fair to the public and to the open process that all options are explored. We had Councilmember McNutt speak of open government. We had members of the audience speak of open government. That's what the initiative process should be. It shouldn't be one point of view concerned about a competing initiative that might make their initiative fail. The voters should have a choice. And if the council finds merit in offering that choice, they should be awarded every opportunity to present that choice. And waiting until March 3rd for the 9212 report may get us some more information. It may not, but it will almost certainly eliminate the possibility of the option of a counter initiative. And I'm not willing to, this council person's not willing to allow that to happen at this point in time. So my motion is to move to appoint an ad hoc committee to explore the idea of putting on a competing ballot initiative.
I'm going to second that because at this juncture, I'm just not comfortable giving up a council potential opportunity. And I don't know where this exploration of an idea will go. I don't know what an ad hoc committee could do. But if we don't pass this motion, then we will be nowhere on this issue.
Vice Mayor.
I'll support the motion, though I have reservations about it. As I said in conjunction with something else I think last week, it's a mistake to not seek information. So for the limited purpose of exploring the possibility and getting information, I support the motion.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
I'm not going to support the motion, and I don't believe that that it basically ranks up there with elimination of open government if we don't put another initiative on the ballot. I think it has something to do with haphazard government, and I don't think haphazard government works really well. I see this as the time has passed. We are here now, and I am going to, basically look forward to the 9212 report for our next step in the process, which will be for the council to either take a support or opposed or a neutral position on this initiative. But I really don't think that the reality of the situation allows us to do the kind of responsible governance that we are mandated to do by our public, and so I can't support.
In response to Councilmember Brzezinski's comments, my own personal feelings about this are, we have clearly one initiative being proposed, and it clearly received a majority of its funding by the developer, and there's nothing wrong with that. That happens a lot of times with special interest groups putting initiatives on ballots. But I don't see how it is counterintuitive or not productive to explore what options this council has, the elected representatives of the people, to put on possibly a counter ballot initiative should this council choose that that's the action it would like to take. I'm not saying that is the action that will happen. Maybe this council will decide on Mr. Brzezinski's latter comment about taking a position for or against, or a neutral position. But at this point in time, there's very little time, and I think providing the public with more information, whether it be in the exploratory process of a counter initiative, or whether it be a counter initiative so the voters actually have a choice besides yes or no, or maybe there's another choice on there, I think is prudent at this point. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I seconded the motion. I'm supporting the motion. That doesn't mean I don't actually totally agree with what Mr. Brzezinski said and what Ms. McNutt said. It's a challenge up here, and it's a challenge up here tonight. But as I said, I just can't let it just stop right here and now. I just want to see if there's anything else out there.
Further discussion. We have a motion. We have a second. Call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
So the motion carries 3-2. Councilmember Brzezinski and McNutt dissenting.
Mr. Mayor, given the council direction and the appointment of the ad hoc committee, that is usually the discretion of the mayor at this point in time.
So in the interest of time, do my fellow council members wish to remain here on the dais for a couple more minutes to appoint an ad hoc committee? Is that something that could be done this evening, or does that have to be
it's
done in private?
It's not typically done by a vote of the council. It's the mayor appointment. And just given the timeline we're under, today or tomorrow would be helpful.
Okay. Being that there was 2 dissenting votes and 2 votes for the idea, including myself, I will have to take this into consideration. I'll let you know at a later time. I want to thank staff for staying late this evening and all your information. I want to thank the public for staying late. Thank you for coming out and sharing all your comments with us this evening. And this meeting is adjourned.